Daenerys Targaryen stood upon the highest deck of the great caravel stormchaser, the brisk sea wind streaming through her silver hair. The ship rolled and pitched as it moved steadily across the narrow sea, cutting through choppy waters beneath a heavy gray sky. Far behind her lay the continent of Essos, a land that now knew her name in fearful whispers and adoring cheers alike. Before her, drawing ever closer, rose the easternmost shores of Westeros. There, new gods and old awaited her return. There, a savage and brutal war raged. And there, if the tales and the letter from Varys had spoken true, her destiny would be forged in dragonfire. She drew in a deep breath, tasting salt and possibility on the wind. Once, she had been a frightened child married off to a Dothraki call, wandering a bleak desert without hope of rescue. But from the moment her dragon eggs had cracked and spilled forth living flame, she was transformed. She no longer felt fear. She had known only hunger for the Iron Throne, her birthright, by all the laws of gods and men. No matter that a half-dozen different kings and would-be kings now squabbled over Westeros like dogs over a bone, the throne was hers. A new age had dawned when those eggs hatched, and in that dawn, all the old pretenders would vanish in flame. Beside her, Ser Jorah Mormont cleared his throat. He was a constant presence at her side, knight, counselor, friend. Though exiled from the north, Jorah carried something of the old Bear Island in his bearing, a quiet determination never to yield. "We should see land in a matter of hours, Your Grace," he told her. He had taken to calling her that again once she declared her intent to cross the sea. King's Landing is still many leagues south, of course, but if the weather holds, we'll make good time. Daenerys nodded without looking at him, her violet eyes trained on the horizon. She felt the presence of her dragons before she heard them. The largest was Drogon, black and red, a knight of obsidian scales lit by fresh wounds of living flame. Then came Regal, with scales that shimmered emerald and bronze. Finally, Viserion, pale gold and white like bleached bone. Even from her vantage, she could see their silhouettes in the clouds, circling overhead in a lazy, majestic dance. In Essos, many had begun calling Drogon the new Balerion, but to her eyes, he was already beyond that. He dwarfed the ships around them. When he descended from the skies, people cowered as if in the presence of a living mountain. In Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen, Daenerys had discovered a secret within the old texts left behind by the warlocks of Qarth. Some called it forbidden knowledge, others thought it no more than a rumor. The arts of Valyrian sorcery that might accelerate the growth of dragons. Whether it was her Targaryen blood, or the resonance of the old rites she invoked, the results had been terrifying and wondrous in equal measure. By the time she was done toppling the cities of Slaver's Bay, her dragons were growing at 3 times the normal rate, then 4 times, and with each passing month, they became bigger than the oldest dragons in the stories, bigger even than Balerion the Black Dread, said to be large enough for his wingspan to engulf entire towns in shadow. The greatest minds among her advisors had cautioned her about unleashing such power unchecked. But she was not reckless. She had demanded the respect of these beasts, and given them her love. She wanted them powerful, yes, but they were not her enemies. They were her children. And now, as she drew closer to the shore of a land once ruled by her forefathers, she knew she commanded 3 living creatures of such destructive might that the entire realm trembled at the thought. Varys's last letter had been brief but pointed. The War of the 5 Kings had left the continent ravaged and uncertain. Each faction was locked in a struggle for power. If she invaded now, she would find the armies of Westeros scattered, tired, hungry, and unprepared. The time had come for fire and blood. The ghosts of her father and brother haunted her, though. She would not be like the Mad King, she told herself, setting all beneath her ablaze for mere whim. But she would also not be helpless. She would inspire fear in her enemies. She would make them bend the knee or burn. In the distance, Drogon gave a thunderous roar, a challenge that echoed across the waves. The hours slipped by beneath that heavy sky. By late morning, the coastline was in clear view. Dark cliffs rising from the sea, the occasional watchtower perched precariously on jagged rock. Yora brought a spyglass to his eye and scanned the shore. "No major force in sight," he murmured. "It seems we caught them all unprepared. Only a few fishing boats. Likely they have no idea who we are." Daenerys looked back at her fleet. Though not vast by any means, she commanded more ships than she had dared imagine a year ago. Her allies in Pentos, funded by certain silent supporters in Westeros itself, had ensured she did not cross alone. The Stormcrows, once mercenaries, had sworn their swords to her after she freed their enslaved families in Essos. Some smaller, ragtag Essosi companies followed as well, lured by the promise of dragon gold or by the mythic power she wielded. All told, it was enough to establish a beachhead. Enough, too, to draw the eyes of kings and queens alike. She let Yora coordinate the landing. He was more than capable of it. Her own thoughts turned inward as they anchored off the coast. She thought of the War of the Five Kings, Joffrey Baratheon installed in King's Landing, Robb Stark hailed as king in the north, Balon Greyjoy styling himself king of the Isles, Stannis Baratheon, the rightful lord of Dragonstone by law, but now also claiming to be the rightful king, and Renly Baratheon, who had been slain by shadow and rumor. She recalled from Varys's intelligence that the lines were not so simple as they might seem. Many lords had declared for one side or another, and the people, used to the authority of the Iron Throne, were confused and frightened. War had turned the Riverlands into a graveyard, with House Lannister and House Stark clashing relentlessly. Now word was House Tyrell had thrown in with Joffrey after Renly's death, though the rumors said they had also spurned Stannis after the Battle of the Blackwater. The realm was in chaos. Still, the might of these war-weary houses was formidable. Even a tired lion had claws, and the rumors about Tywin Lannister's cunning were not to be dismissed. Yet Daenerys had something beyond mere cunning. She had 3 monstrous dragons, grown in unnatural leaps and bounds thanks to the secrets gleaned from Valyrian glyphs. They seemed impervious to even scorpion bolts. Kartha's best attempts to chain them had snapped like kindling. Reports that Dragonstone's catapults or King's Landing scorpions might bring them down had become laughable to her. Valyrian sorcery, dark and twisting though it was, had not simply sped their growth. It had hardened their scales until they were nearly invulnerable to common steel or iron. Their hides shimmered with something like living enchantment. No tales of old even spoke of Balerion as truly impervious. He was wounded in his time by cunning knights or accidents, but her dragons seemed to shrug off everything. If even Balerion had been the dread of the skies, Drogon was more. At times, she felt a flicker of fear at how unstoppable they had become. With that fear came a sense of responsibility and, yes, a certain savage joy. She would be the queen who had come to claim what was hers with unstoppable draconic might. Westeros would see the truth of her claim, see the living proof that the blood of old Valyria still ran hot in her veins. Bending the knee would be the wisest choice for all who wished to live. The ship scraped gently against the rocky shore. Daenerys descended the plank with the bearing of a queen who had stepped forth not for conquest alone, but to fulfill prophecy. The gulls shrieked overhead. The salty breeze pressed her silken dress against her body. Yora and her blood riders, men once sworn to call Drogo, fanned out around her. She lifted a hand to the east, signaling her dragons. In a flourish of wind, they descended. Drogon landed on the beach with a thunderous impact, sand erupting around his gargantuan talons. His spine tail twitched impatiently, and his eyes, the color of molten gold, surveyed the land as if it were a brand new feast. Daenerys placed a hand upon Drogon's flank, feeling the warmth of him, the living furnace within. This was the first time any Targaryen dragon had set foot on Westerosi soil since the Dance of the Dragons, and she could not help but feel the weight of history. Drogon snorted, sending a gust of hot breath over her and stirring her hair. She patted him fondly. Her host had begun unloading supplies. Tents, horses, barrels of provisions, all the things needed to sustain her force. It would not be a large-scale invasion yet. She only needed to secure a foothold. Nearby, Yora pointed out a cliffside path that led up to a fortification. Likely an old watchpost built centuries ago, seldom used. "It's the best spot for a camp, Your Grace," he said. We can see ships coming from either direction, and we'll have a defensible position if we're attacked." Daenerys nodded. "I want it. Send some men to clear out anyone inside. No unnecessary bloodshed, but no mercy for those who raise arms against me." She looked to her blood riders, who grinned with predatory excitement at the chance to prove themselves. They wasted no time. While her outriders advanced, Daenerys turned her gaze inland. It was a barren, rocky stretch of coastline here, but Westeros was a bountiful land. Further in, farmland and villages dotted the landscape. She thought of them with a mixture of sympathy and resolve. Her father had been a tyrant in his final days, but her ancestors were not also. She believed with all her heart she could be the queen the realm needed. Just, strong, tempered by kindness but fearsome in wrath. She thought of all the innocents who suffered as these self-made kings warred for a throne that was not theirs. She would show them a better way, under the banner of the dragon. Word spread quickly. Within days of her arrival, peasants from nearby villages came to the cliffside watchpost. Some approached with trepidation, half frozen in terror at the sight of Drogon perched on the rampart. Others were bolder, led by the rumor that the dragons were more wondrous than any who had existed since the doom of Valyria. Daenerys did not discourage their fascination. She welcomed the curious, allowed them glimpses of the winged titans, and let them see she was not a monster. She learned of their hardships, the levies demanded by the various kings, the raids by outlaws. The peasants had no loyalty left to the crown. Who was even the rightful crown these days? They simply wanted peace. And though they trembled to see a dragon's open maw, they looked upon Daenerys with a strange new hope. At night, Daenerys would stand atop the watchpost and gaze up at the dark sky, watch her dragons wheel among the clouds, occasionally spitting a burst of flame. She heard whispers in the camp about the Lannisters, the Tyrells, the Baratheons, the Starks, and the Greyjoys. Each was formidable in their own right, yet none had the power that she wielded. But she also knew the cunning of men could never be discounted. Her father had lost his throne, her brother had lost his life. Only the truly foolish believed the outcome was certain just because she had monstrous dragons at her side. Still, the advantage was hers. She would use it carefully, systematically, to bring the realm to its knees. Scattered reports reached her over the following weeks. One scout told her that the Lannisters were massed near the Riverlands, pushing back against Robb Stark's forces after a recent victory. The Tyrells had taken the City of Kings Landing by supplying food during the chaos. Stannis Baratheon was rumored to be on Dragonstone, plotting his next move after the disastrous defeat on the Blackwater. Balon Greyjoy was raiding the north, focusing on plunder rather than pitched battles. The realm was truly in disarray. She decided her first display of power would be to strike at a key Lannister position. The Lannisters still sat the Iron Throne by virtue of Joffrey, who claimed to be the son of Robert Baratheon but was widely rumored to be born of incest between Queen Cersei and her brother Jaime. It mattered little to Daenerys. The boy was an usurper, no better than any other pretender. If she wanted to shatter the illusions of the Seven Kingdoms that the Iron Throne was effectively controlled by Lannister gold, she needed a spectacular blow. Ser Jorah brought her a piece of news that presented the perfect opportunity. Tywin Lannister himself was said to be leading an army south of Harrenhal, hoping to reinforce some vulnerable holdings. Tywin, the legendary strategist who had orchestrated the Red Wedding with Walder Frey, so the rumors claimed, and who commanded fear among all the lords of Westeros. If Daenerys broke Tywin's host, that would send a message no other victory could match. In secret councils beneath the watchpost's torchlit hall, she formulated a plan with her captains. "We will surprise them," she said. "Descend with the dragons, and let them see the meaning of Targaryen fire, but we'll spare those who throw down their arms. This will not be a slaughter for slaughter's sake. I want them to understand that kneeling is their only chance at survival." Her blood riders grinned at that, eager to spill blood, but they trusted her word. Jorah nodded, although she could sense his worry. He did not love relying so heavily on the dragons in a pitched battle, but he knew it was the surest way to victory. The next day, Daenerys departed with a contingent of her best fighters. They had horses enough for a swift strike, but truly, their speed would come from the air. She rode Drogon. Her blood riders, by some gift of her will and the dragon's acceptance, had taken to flying on Rhaegal and Viserion. It was not the same bond she shared with them. Drogon answered to no one but Daenerys, but her knights could guide the dragons to some degree, enough to soar across the skies like fabled dragon lords of old. They took flight at dawn, the rising sun painting the horizon with bands of orange and crimson. The wind lashed Daenerys' cheeks, exhilarating and cold. Drogon's wings beat with a thunderous rhythm. The land below rushed by in a blur of fields, forests, and winding roads. If any watchers looked up, they would see the dreadful silhouettes of not one, but 3 dragons. That alone would shatter many hearts with terror. They found Tywin's host where the scouts had said they would, near the banks of the Trident, camped in orderly rows. The Lannister tents bore their crimson and gold banners, a lion's roar in the breeze. The Outriders had posted watch, but none expected dragons. Lannister archers looked at the sky in disbelief when Drogon's black shape momentarily blocked out the sun. They scrambled to load their bows. Pitiful gesture. Daenerys let out a shout. Drogon dove. The archers loosed arrows, which cracked and ricocheted harmlessly from Drogon's enchanted scales. The next moment, a torrent of dragonfire bathed the front rank in searing orange flame. The screams of men and horses filled the air, accompanied by the roar of burning canvas. Then Rhaegal and Viserion descended from behind, unleashing their own fury upon the cavalry lines. Already the Lannister host seemed to break. Some men threw down their weapons and fled. Others stumbled on, desperate to rally. She kept a keen eye out for Tywin. She doubted he would cower in a tent. Indeed, her sharp eyes soon found him atop his warhorse, surrounded by a small group of knights. They wore the red and gold of Lannister, but she could sense their fear. She guided Drogon lower, swooping toward Tywin as if to snatch him from the earth. In a calm show of bravery that almost impressed her, Tywin did not flee. Instead, his men tried to form a spear wall, aiming upward. Drogon bared his teeth, exposing fangs like scimitars. Daenerys raised her voice to be heard over the din of war. "Throw down your spears, men of Lannister," she cried, "or feed my dragons." Her voice carried, amplified by the swirl of wind. She had not used the Valyrian glyphs lightly, but it was not just the dragons that were bound in power. There was a resonance in her words that stirred a primal dread in the hearts of men. She saw many of them falter, drop their spears, and fall to their knees. Tywin, to his credit, remained tall in the saddle. She could almost see the calculation in his green eyes. If he fought, he would lose. If he fled, he would lose face. So he did neither. He sat absolutely still, as if daring her to do her worst. "Do you yield, Lord Tywin?" Daenerys demanded, holding back Drogon with the mastery of a rider who shared one mind with her mount. Drogon roared and exhaled a spurt of flame, scorching a line into the mud before the Lannister knights. The ground hissed with heat. In the hush that followed, Tywin looked up at her. "It seems I have no choice," he said, voice crisp and controlled. And then, with a flick of his glove, he dismounted, handing the reins of his horse to a trembling knight. Tywin knelt in the muddy grass. His knights, seeing their lord bend the knee, quickly followed suit. Daenerys' heart pounded. She felt almost giddy with triumph, but she held her composure. She circled once more above the battered, smoking remains of the Lannister camp and watched as her blood riders set down with Rhaegal and Viserion. The battle was done. Lannister men were kneeling or else running for their lives, dropping weapons as they fled. Smoke coiled from burning tents. The smell of scorched flesh churned in the air. She could not bring herself to feel pity for them. They had chosen to stand against the rightful queen. She landed before Tywin, who rose to his feet in a slow, deliberate motion. His face was unreadable. The man was proud, cunning, and ruthless. "I would offer you a parley," he said, "but I suspect you have come to see me on my knees, so here I am." "You are wise to yield," Daenerys replied. "Your men will live if they swear fealty to me. As for you, Lord Tywin, You will be treated with respect if you pledge your loyalty, on pain of dragonfire should you betray me." Her tone gave no room for negotiation, and Tywin knew it. He inclined his head. "Long live Daenerys Targaryen," he said, though his eyes remained as cold as winter. The capitulation of Tywin Lannister echoed across the Seven Kingdoms with the swiftness of a storm wind. The rumors took many forms. Some said that Tywin had been half-burned to death. Others claimed that Daenerys's dragons were bigger than mountains, bigger than Balerion himself. Stories circulated that their scales were impervious to any weapon, that not even the strongest warhammer could dent them, that scorpion bolts shattered on impact. Soldiers shivered at the talk of entire battalions being roasted alive in a single pass. The reality, in many ways, was worse for those who opposed her. With Tywin's surrender, the Lannisters lost their figurehead of discipline and strategy. Cersei was rumored to be near madness in King's Landing, while Joffrey was a sadistic boy king who inspired no loyalty. Jaime Lannister was still in the field, but overshadowed by the knowledge that their father had yielded to the Targaryen queen. House Tyrell, who had so recently bound itself to the Lannisters in King's Landing, began to waver, uncertain if it should pledge loyalty to a faltering cause. Allies can vanish quickly when defeat is a near certainty. While some Westerosi lords might have welcomed a Targaryen return, nostalgic for the centuries-long rule of the Dragon Kings, others were determined to resist. Stannis Baratheon considered himself the true heir of Robert, the rightful king by law. Balon Greyjoy wanted only the Iron Isles' independence. And Robb Stark, though some whispered he might prefer to be king in the north alone, would not simply kneel to another southern ruler. Yet the War of the Five Kings was as good as shattered in that one act. Daenerys, ironically, had simplified everything, though the realm's lords had not yet awakened to it. They would. 2 weeks after Tywin's submission, Daenerys' forces had grown. Lannister bannermen, forced to choose between loyalty to a bested lion or survival under a triumphant dragon, were pledging themselves in droves. She established a forward camp in the Riverlands to keep watch. The River Lords themselves, decimated by the fighting, had sent envoys to treat with this new queen. But before she could deal with them, she received an unexpected summons. Robb Stark, king in the north, desired a meeting. He was camped near Riverrun, the seat of House Tully. She agreed, for she had no particular hatred for the Starks. Indeed, by all accounts, they were an honorable people, undone by the Lannisters' treachery. If there was a chance to avoid further war, she would take it. She brought Drogon, of course. She would be a fool to leave her might behind. Yora, as ever, counseled caution, reminding her of what had happened to her brother Rhaegar at the Trident. But Daenerys was not Rhaegar, and she had dragons that no mortal force could match. They met in a broad meadow by the Red Fork, not far from Riverrun's walls. The day was overcast, the air heavy with the scent of damp grass. Robb Stark arrived with a small retinue, a tall young man with the bearing of a seasoned warrior, a gray direwolf stalking at his side. The direwolf was immense, larger than any normal beast, but it was dwarfed by Drogon's presence overhead, circling in lazy loops. When they were face to face, Daenerys studied Robb. She saw the haunted look in his eyes. He had suffered much loss. He had proven himself a capable commander, but that was not enough to topple the Lannisters. Now, the realm had a new threat to consider, one that dwarfed any mortal army. Robb inclined his head stiffly. "Your Grace," he said. There was no deference in his voice, though. He was simply being polite. "You've come at a time of great turmoil." Daenerys nodded. "So I've seen." She glanced at the direwolf. Its eyes glowed with a fierce intelligence, and it growled softly as it sniffed at her dragon's scent on the breeze. Drogon roared from above in warning, his cry making the horses of Robb's party stomp and shy. "You call yourself king in the north. Do you intend to stand against me, or will you bend the knee?" Robb's jaw tightened. "My father served a king who brought ruin to this land," he said carefully. "I have no love for the Mad King or his heirs, but the North has suffered too much at the hands of Southerners. We wanted only independence, to rule ourselves free of Southern wars and Southern squabbles. Daenerys looked him in the eye. "I am not my father. I seek to unite the realm, not to burn it. But I will not tolerate open rebellion. If your north stands in my way, you know what will happen." Their gaze held for a long moment. The wind rustled the tall grass. Finally, Robb's expression shifted. "I have heard tales of your war in Slaver's Bay," he said. "You freed thousands from bondage. You are not the monster the Lannisters claimed. If I had reason to believe you would treat the North with fairness, respect our traditions, and guard us from future threats, perhaps there could be an accord." A hush fell. Yora and the others at Daenerys's back exchanged glances. She could see hope and wariness alike among them. Many thought that the only way to rule Westeros was to subdue it entirely. Yet here was Robb Stark, a formidable foe, offering a chance at peace, if his conditions were met. Daenerys's voice was soft. "I will be the queen of all 7 kingdoms. But the North has always been different. We can speak of what autonomy you might have under my reign. However, the swords of the North must be mine if ever the realm is threatened. You will recognize me as the sole sovereign of Westeros, in the tradition of Aegon the Conqueror. In return, I will name you Warden of the North, with greater autonomy than any other region. Your lords will keep their own laws, as long as they do not conflict with the Iron Throne. I will also swear before gods old and new that the atrocities committed by past kings will not be repeated." He listened closely, measuring her words. "And if I refuse?" She allowed herself a small, sad smile. "Then the war continues, and your men will burn under dragonfire like so many others. I do not wish that to happen, nor I think do you." The young king in the north considered it. His direwolf pressed against his leg, a silent guardian. At length, Robb inclined his head again. "I have lost too much already. My father, my mother, my bannermen. We have seen enough war to last a lifetime. I accept, with one condition. You will also vow that the moment you break your word, the North will be free to secede. If you truly are not your father, if you truly intend to be just, you should have no fear of such a vow." Daenerys saw the sense in that. A dragon need not fear the honest scrutiny of men. "I will vow it," she said firmly. Thus it was done. In a single stroke, the War of the 5 Kings was all but undone. Robb Stark bent the knee and rose again as Warden of the North, sworn to Daenerys Targaryen. The River Lords, battered by the Lannisters, followed suit quickly, seeing that defiance was pointless. With Tywin Lannister captive, or well, more of a guest, and Robb Stark allied, the Iron Throne soon seemed a hollow seat. All that remained was to take King's Landing. Cersei Lannister's reaction was predictable. She barred the gates, seized every store of wildfire, and prepared to defend the city with madness and cunning. Joffrey, rumor said, was eager to mount the Dragon Queen's head on a pike. But few believed the city had the means to resist the unstoppable might of 3 dragons. Meanwhile, House Tyrell's loyalty began to fray as they saw the unstoppable tide approaching. Mace Tyrell, ever an opportunist, sent discreet feelers to Daenerys, seeking terms for an alliance. Daenerys, sensing an easy route into the capital, welcomed the conversation. So it came to pass that Mace Tyrell convinced the city guard to open the gates for Daenerys' forces. He had men inside the city, men who remembered how House Tyrell had fed King's Landing in its time of need. The Gold Cloaks were demoralized, uncertain if fighting for a mad boy king was worth their lives. On a gray morning in mid-autumn, Daenerys Targaryen rode at the head of her host, passing beneath the walls of King's Landing with minimal resistance. Her banners fluttered in the wind, the red 3-headed dragon on a field of black. Above, Drogon soared in great arcs. The city's inhabitants crowded the windows and rooftops for a glimpse. The rumor of an invading queen on monstrous dragons had spread through the city like wildfire. Terrified and awestruck, they muttered prayers to the Seven that the new queen would not reduce them to ash. Daenerys marched through the streets, her unsullied. Acquired and freed in Astapor, now wholly loyal, forming a silent, disciplined shield around her. The ragged small folk parted, clutching their children. Some spat and cursed. Others wept with hope that a new reign might bring them peace. She felt the weight of their eyes upon her. She could hear the hush in the crowd, broken only by distant shouts and the pounding of her army's boots. When she reached the Red Keep, she found the gates barred. Within, some last loyalists to Joffrey cowered behind the fortress walls. But the gold cloaks on the battlements looked ready to run. And high above, Drogon circled, a living threat. Daenerys raised her hand, and her men brought forth a battering ram. Before they could strike, though, there was a sudden crash of metal as the gate was thrown open from within. Mace Tyrell's men had indeed done their work, betraying the last holdouts. The Red Keep, the seat of Targaryen kings for centuries, was hers for the taking. As her forces flooded into the courtyard, Daenerys heard a piercing scream. A figure had burst out onto the ramparts. Joffrey Baratheon, pale with rage, brandishing a crossbow. "Traitors!" he shrieked, voice echoing. "I am your king. I'll kill every last one of you, feed you to the dogs." He fired a bolt wildly, and it sank into a wooden post near Daenerys. A foolish gesture. Before Joffrey could reload, an arm wrapped around him. Jaime Lannister, looking desperate, pulled the boy back. The Kingslayer locked eyes with Daenerys across the courtyard. She could see the torment there, perhaps the memory of how he had once slain the Mad King to spare the city from wildfire. Now he faced a new Targaryen. But Daenerys was not Aerys. She signaled her knights. They surged up the ramparts. Jaime did not resist as they took Joffrey into custody. The boy flailed, shrieking, "I am the king. I'll have your heads. All of you. Mother. Mother." Cersei Lannister was found in the throne room, perched on the Iron Throne, as if by sheer willpower she could keep it. Her golden hair spilled over her shoulders in a disheveled mess, and a wild light danced in her emerald eyes. "You have no right," she hissed at Daenerys. "My son is king. You come with your dragons and your illusions. You think we'll just bow to you?" Daenerys entered the throne room with slow, echoing steps. The weight of history pressed in on her. This was the seat from which her father had once ruled, and from which Robert Baratheon had stolen her birthright. Now, at last, she saw it before her. The Iron Throne, a hulking mass of twisted swords. It looked smaller than she'd imagined, less majestic, more a symbol of the cruelty and chaos that had forged it. She turned her gaze to Cersei. "You lost the moment Tywin bent the knee. You lost the moment your own city opened its gates to me." She approached, and the Lannister queen clutched the arms of the throne so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You are nothing but a would-be conqueror," Cersei spat. "Your father was mad." "Burn them all," he said. "Burn them all." Daenerys' eyes blazed. "I am not my father." With a silent gesture, she commanded a pair of Unsullied to seize Cersei. The queen tried to resist, shrieking curses, but she was unarmed and powerless now. Daenerys felt neither pity nor glee. The wheel that had ground over the realm for years would stop. She turned from Cersei to the dais where the throne rose, its swords glinting in the torchlight. She ascended the steps. Memories of stories, half-forgotten dreams, pressed upon her. She recalled the house words, fire and blood. For centuries, the Targaryens had ruled from this seat. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingertips brushing the cold steel. Then she turned, sat upon the Iron Throne. Silence. The courtiers and soldiers, the lords and knights, all beheld her with awe. There was a hush that stretched for a long moment. Daenerys Targaryen, first of her name, was queen. She looked out over them, taking the measure of her victory. Somewhere beyond these walls, Drogon's roar carried on the wind. Varys emerged from the shadows, bowing with a small smile. Ser Jorah bowed as well, followed by Mace Tyrell, who had already pledged his loyalty. Jaime Lannister dropped to one knee, face tense. Then the mass of lords and soldiers in the throne room sank to their knees. The hush broke with murmurs of "Your Grace," and "All hail the Queen." Cersei, pinned by Unsullied, glared up at Daenerys with seething hatred. Joffrey, dragged in by knights, shrieked for them to release him. But Daenerys had no illusions about the difficulty of ruling. She had taken the throne by might. To hold it, she would need justice, fairness, and the unyielding presence of her dragons. But she would also need to show mercy where she could, to show she was not Aerys, nor Robert, nor Joffrey. She would not become a tyrant. In the days that followed, King's Landing slowly came to accept its new queen. Daenerys ordered that the city be spared any further sack. There was no mass slaughter. Crimes were punished, but the innocent were not harmed. She commanded that food be distributed from the Tyrell stores, ensuring the small folk would not starve. Where she walked, accompanied by the Unsullied, the people were quiet, watchful, uncertain. But no longer did the air bristle with the stench of fear and violence that had lingered under Joffrey. She granted Jaime Lannister a chance to atone. He had once betrayed her father, yes, but it was to save the city. The lines between betrayal and heroism were blurred. She named him to the Kingsguard conditionally. If he could prove his loyalty to the realm, if he could show that his oath meant something, she would spare him. Cersei she confined to a tower pending a trial. Joffrey raged in captivity, but Daenerys deemed him unfit to rule. She could have put him to death, but she was not yet certain if she wished to make a martyr of him. He was, after all, only a boy, though a cruel one. Across the realm, the news of Daenerys' triumph spread. The veil under Lady Lisa Arryn wavered. The Greyjoys rampaged in the north, though now faced with a united Stark and Targaryen front. Their position became precarious. Stannis Baratheon on Dragonstone was the last major threat. He had once nearly taken King's Landing, and though battered, he was unyielding. He had the Baratheon name and the Red Priestess at his side. Some said he had a claim sanctioned by the Lord of Light. Daenerys summoned him to treat. He refused, coldly proclaiming that she was the spawn of the Mad King, that his was the just claim. He would not bow, so Daenerys prepared her forces once more. If Stannis would not bend, he would break. The realm had suffered enough war, but a final confrontation might be necessary. She gathered her fleets, the Tyrell navy, and a portion of her dragons. Yora cautioned that she was riding the wave of a stunning victory, but if she let Stannis gather strength, the fight might be bloody. Best to strike swiftly. She took Drogon, as always. Upon the deck of a Tyrell war galley, she oversaw the approach to Dragonstone. The ancient Targaryen stronghold rose from the sea in jagged, dark rock, carved into the shapes of dragons' heads and tails. She felt a shiver of ancestral pride. This was the seat of House Targaryen before Aegon's conquest, and now it was in the hands of a usurper. She would take it back by word or by flame. Stannis had ringed the castle with archers and scorpions, though what use that would be against a dragon so colossal was questionable. Still, Daenerys knew he might have that Red Priestess, Melisandre, who wielded strange powers. She would not underestimate sorcery. Valyrian sorcery had protected her dragons, but there were other magics in the world. The followers of R'hllor drew upon a different flame, perhaps. She had to remain vigilant. At dawn, Daenerys gave the signal. Her ships advanced, catapults hurling stones at the walls. Scorpion bolts whistled overhead. Meanwhile, Drogon soared high, with Rhaegal and Viserion flanking. The watchers on the battlements must have felt horror to see not one, but 3 monstrous dragons blotting out the sun. Their roars mingled, echoing across the sea. At the front gate, Stannis himself stood, sword in hand, battered crown upon his brow. Red-robed Melisandre stood at his side, chanting in some unknown tongue. Daenerys glimpsed strange shadows flickering around them. She felt a prickle of unease. Could they truly harm her dragons? Drogon dove, letting loose a torrent of flame at the parapets. Men scattered, screaming as the stone itself cracked under the intense heat. Scorpion bolts soared upward. Some struck Drogon's body and snapped in two, clattering harmlessly into the sea. She felt her blood sing with the power of it. Her dragon was unstoppable. Rhaegal and Viserion joined in, pounding the fortress with searing bursts of fire. Yet on the main battlement, Melisandre raised her hands. A swirling darkness coalesced, forming shapes that darted into the sky. Shadows among shadows, they seemed intangible, yet hungry. One drifted near Viserion's flank, and Daenerys heard the pale dragon shriek in alarm. She felt a jolt of terror. This was some black magic, a shadow in the shape of something monstrous. But the Valyrian sorcery woven into Viserion scales repelled it. The shadow seemed to hiss in silent agony, unable to penetrate the wards. It disintegrated under the force of the dragon's living flame. On the ground, Stannis watched, jaw set, as all his defenses failed. Melisandre cried out incantations, but her shadows melted under the pure destructive might of the dragons. The unstoppable fury of Valyrian sorcery nullified whatever illusions and curses she summoned. In minutes, the fortress walls were ablaze, the gates battered down by catapults. Dragonstone's defenders surrendered or died. Stannis, proud and unwavering, made one last stand in the courtyard. When Daenerys landed with Drogon, the man stared up at her with a face carved of granite. "You are not my queen," he said. "I do not yield." Daenerys felt a twinge of sorrow for him. Stannis had fought so long for what he believed was right, but she could not let him stand as a pretender. "Then you will burn," she said simply. He did not cry out as Drogon's flame engulfed him. The Red Priestess Melisandre vanished into the chaos, though no one could say if she fled or died in the flames. In that moment, the last major rival for the Iron Throne perished. The War of the Five Kings was done, undone by a queen with dragons that no mortal force could match. Westeros had never known a power so absolute since the days of Aegon the Conqueror. Yet even Aegon's conquests had met pockets of fierce resistance. Daenerys found many of the lords of Westeros more than ready to swear fealty, if it meant preserving their lands and people. She was hailed as Daenerys Stormborn, Mother of Dragons, Breaker of Chains, the Unburnt, and now the undisputed queen. In King's Landing, she set about rebuilding. She took wise counsel from Ser Jorah, from Tyrion Lannister, who arrived from the Vale, having parted ways with his father's cause once. He heard of Tywin's surrender, and from Varys the Spider. She restructured the small council, seeking to balance the influences of various regions, not letting any single house hold too much power. She also sought to unite the realm by the might of her dragons, yet temper that might with fairness. Wherever she traveled, be it the Stormlands or Dorne, she brought Drogon, ensuring no lord dared raise a rebellion. But she also listened to their grievances, worked to lower the crushing taxes demanded by the Lannisters' war, and enforced laws that protected the small folk from exploitation. She promised pardons for those who had fought against her but yielded. She freed many who had been imprisoned under Joffrey's twisted rule. As the months passed, a new stability began to take hold, though the memory of Dragonfire was never far away. Her dragons continued to grow, bigger even than the ancient tales. Their wings created storms of dust and wind whenever they took flight. They soared across the realm, unstoppable, unassailable. Some maesters wrote that Drogon was the mightiest living creature ever to take wing, surpassing even the legends of Balerion. Indeed, there was a saying on every tongue. Not even the Black Dread could match the black beast of the Dragon Queen. And with the wards of Valyrian sorcery layered upon them by Daenerys' hand, they seemed utterly invulnerable. No arrow, bolt, blade, or poison availed. Even the cunning designs of Qyburn, who had once served Cersei, were worthless. The realm realized that as long as Daenerys lived, her dragons ruled the skies without contest. Robb Stark, now Warden of the North, slowly rebuilt Winterfell after it was sacked by the Greyjoys. Balon Greyjoy, who had declared himself King of the Isles, was forced to bend the knee when Daenerys herself flew to Pike. The sight of Drogon's black mass hovering over the Iron Islands, blotting out the sun as waves crashed and sprayed brine, convinced Balon that no castle of stone or sea would save him. Thus, the North regained its stolen territories. Balon was allowed to keep a measure of autonomy on the Iron Isles, but only as a lord. The days of kings outside the Targaryen crown were over. In the following year, Daenerys traveled the kingdoms, from the arid deserts of Dorne to the frosty moors beyond the Neck. She sat in judgment of disputes, reigned in rebellious lords, and rewarded loyal service. She insisted that the reforms she had begun in Essos could have their place in Westeros, too, particularly the abolition of slavery, though that practice was far rarer in the Seven Kingdoms. Still, she cracked down on the trafficking of small folk and the forced servitude that had arisen in the chaos of the war. She formed alliances through marriages, though she herself did not immediately wed. Some courted her, from influential lords to foreign princes, but she refused to rush into a match that would limit her or overshadow her authority. To the small folk, she was something out of a story, a queen astride a dragon mightier than any living memory, proclaiming herself both conqueror and liberator. Some feared her as a goddess of war, while others praised her as a savior. She was, in truth, both. She knew that the might she wielded had no equal and that such absolute power carried with it the seeds of corruption. She recalled her father's descent into madness and the lessons of Essos, where she had nearly been undone by pride more than once. So she labored tirelessly to hold the realm not through terror alone, but by forging a future that gave men fewer reasons to rise against her. Word trickled across the narrow sea to Essos, telling of the unstoppable queen who had claimed her forefathers' seat. Merchants and travelers brought news back to Pentos and Volantis of a Targaryen so strong her dragons were bigger than Balerion and impervious to any weapon known. In some corners, cults sprang up worshipping the Dragon Queen as a living goddess. Daenerys paid them no mind. She had learned in Qarth how dangerous such notions could be. Yet not all threats were external. Within the Red Keep, plots simmered. Some men whispered that Daenerys was too powerful, that a queen so unconquerable was a danger to the natural order of things. Nobles who had lost fortunes in the war nursed grudges. The faith of the Seven watched carefully, while many septons preached that Daenerys's victories were the will of the gods. Others considered dragons an abomination. Daenerys took care to reconcile with the faith, offering grants and rebuilding septs destroyed in the war. She was not naive enough to ignore the influence the faith could wield over the small folk. One night there was an attempt to poison her, a cup of wine delivered by a trembling servant. Daenerys smelled the bitterness, recognized the color. She calmly refused to drink, and the servant, discovered to be in the pay of some disgruntled lord, was dragged to the dungeons. Rumors spread that the queen was protected by more than just dragons, that she possessed the same unnatural resilience to toxins that her father had once boasted of. That was not entirely true, but she allowed such rumors to stand. Fear was a weapon, too. Time passed. The realm stabilized under her rule, the great houses bending the knee or quietly vanishing from the stage. Even the Lannisters, with Tywin as a humbled advisor of sorts, served her in the capacity of master of coin, though Tywin's cunning was now put toward building the crown's treasury rather than war. Freed from the chaos of the War of the Five Kings, the people began to rebuild. Harvests improved, trade resumed, roads were made safe again. Daenerys poured resources into ensuring the roads were patrolled and outlaws swiftly dealt with. She had come during the War of the Five Kings, a time when the land was exhausted and starved for order. She had preempted major battles, like a second clash on the Blackwater or another slaughter in the Riverlands, by simply arriving with overwhelming force, forcing men to kneel before they could ruin themselves further. In that sense, her conquest was swifter, less bloody than it might have been. The realm had spilled enough blood between the Starks and Lannisters to fill many a river. Daenerys had ended that war in a single stroke of draconic might. And so, beneath the watchful wings of 3 dragons the size of small mountains, the 7 kingdoms found an odd measure of peace. The new queen was neither saint nor demon. She ruled with compassion and a steel will, wielding her unstoppable children as a final argument against rebellion. The lords learned to heed her decrees, for to defy her was to face a horror no man could match. If sometimes a hush of fear accompanied her name, so too did the knowledge that she was just, that she freed slaves and punished tyrants. In time, that might be enough to forge a lasting era of stability. As she walked the ramparts of the Red Keep one evening, peering down at King's Landing lit by the glow of lanterns, Daenerys reflected on what she had accomplished. It had been only a few years since she stood alone in the Red Waste, clutching her newly hatched dragons. Now she was queen of the Undulls, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, protector of the realm. Drogon flew overhead, a shadow on the moonlit sky, a constant reminder of her power. She had proven that even a realm in chaos could be united under one ruler, if that ruler came bearing fire and blood. She whispered a silent vow to the memory of those she had lost, from Khal Drogo to Ser Barristan Selmy. She would not squander this chance. The warlords were vanquished, the usurpers undone, and at long last, a Targaryen was again on the Iron Throne. Some claimed her dragons were unstoppable monsters, that her rule was guaranteed by fear. But she hoped that in time, fear would give way to love, that the small folk would see a queen who cared for them. If she succeeded, she would surpass even Aegon. If she failed, she would become the monster she vowed never to be. Below, the city was alive with murmured celebrations. Life went on with all its joys and sorrows. And overhead, the largest dragon the world had ever known let loose a roar that shook the stars. Daenerys closed her eyes, feeling the reverberation in her bones. She was Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, the conqueror returned. And for better or worse, all of Westeros had bowed before her. That night, she finally allowed herself a rare moment of contentment. Surrounded by friends who had become family, Tyrion with his dry wit, Yora with his loyal heart, Missandei with her gentle wisdom, she realized that the realm now rested in her hands. No more war of kings, no more petty struggles that tore the land asunder. She retired to her chambers and gazed out at the dark sky, where Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion soared, their scales glinting with an unearthly sheen beneath the moon's pale light. In the distance, she could hear the hush of the sea beyond Blackwater Bay. The faint hum of thousands of lives lived in the streets below. This was what she had fought for, bled for, sacrificed for. She had not come to Westeros simply to be a tyrant. She had come to break the wheel, to restore a broken realm. With the unstoppable might of her dragons and her unwavering will, she had done just that. One day, she would pass into legend, as all mortal rulers do. But the memory of 3 dragons, grown to monstrous size, impervious to every weapon, crowned in black and red flame, would endure for centuries. Men would speak of the day Daenerys Targaryen came during the War of the Five Kings, shattering it in a blaze of dragonfire, imposing a peace no one else could achieve. They would debate whether she was savior or conqueror. They would tell tales of her mercy and tales of her wrath. But none would deny the raw, awesome fact. Her dragons were mightier than Balerion, her will tempered by her experiences in Essos, and her dominion sealed by the ancient sorceries of Valyria that made her children impervious to all. She was queen, she was fire, she was blood, and the 7 kingdoms, tamed by her hand, would never be the same again. Yet amidst all the power and glory, Daenerys never forgot the face of the frightened girl she had once been, sold to the Dothraki for the promise of an army. She had walked through fire to become who she was now. Each night, she would turn her mind to the thought of what lay beyond the petty squabbles of kings and queens, the true threats to the living, the creeping doom in the far north. Tales from the wall spoke of white walkers and whites, of a cold night creeping across the land. She had come to Westeros earlier than in another fate, earlier than might have been. She had shattered the 5 kings in a year. Perhaps that gave her more time to prepare for what the watchers on the wall claimed was coming. When she closed her eyes, the image of her dragons soared across the dark behind her eyelids. She had preempted the greatest battles of men, uniting the realm under the banner of House Targaryen once more. If the legends of the Long Night were true, she would need that unity in the days to come. The War of the 5 Kings was over, ended by dragonfire. The war for the dawn, if it came, would be hers to wage, and if the realm rallied behind her as fiercely as it had fallen before her, perhaps the living might stand a chance. So she drifted to sleep, the embers of her braziers casting dancing shadows across the walls, accompanied by the knowledge that she was not alone. Her dragons kept watch over the skies. The realm, her new family, her allies, all lay within her power. And for the first time in a long while, Daenerys Targaryen felt a measure of peace. She had come home and she had won. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, the Iron Throne was hers, and Westeros knelt in the presence of the mightiest dragons ever known, living proof of House Targaryen's legacy reborn. No one, Not even the echoes of the old kings would dare deny her now. In the realm's darkest hour, a new queen had emerged, forging a future out of flame. Queen of a united kingdom, mother of dragons beyond measure, and the breaker of a war that had threatened to consume them all. Fire and blood, indeed. The story of Daenerys Targaryen was only beginning, etched in the memory of the Seven Kingdoms with the unstoppable fury of dragon's wings and the bright, fierce hope of a dream long deferred, finally reclaimed. In the weeks that followed Daenerys Targaryen's conquest of King's Landing and the subjugation of her final rivals, life in the capital resumed under a new reality. The small folk stirred with caution and curiosity, unsure whether this Targaryen queen, said to hold the greatest dragons the world had ever seen, would be a benevolent ruler or a tyrant in the footsteps of the Mad King. Yet as the days passed, a tenuous peace took hold. The once constant echoes of war horns and battle cries receded, replaced by the hammering of smiths repairing the city's gates, the barking of street merchants reopening their stalls, and the weary sighs of refugees returning to burnt homes. Food stores from Highgarden arrived in heavily guarded wagons, easing the hunger that had plagued King's Landing for months. Daenerys herself spent many mornings in the throne room, receiving visitors and hearing petitions. It was a methodical, exhausting process. She had no illusions about how swiftly rulership could become complicated. In Meereen, she had learned the bitter lessons of bureaucratic entanglements and shifting alliances. Nonetheless, she persisted. On an unseasonably warm day, she sat the Iron Throne, an uncomfortably cold edifice of twisted metal, and listened to a dispute about farmland outside the city. Lord Giles Rosby claimed certain fields that the crown had confiscated for war rations. A group of small folk insisted those fields belonged to them, or at least that they had squatted there long enough to claim a stake. Ordinarily, such a matter would have been beneath royal notice, but times were fraught, and Daenerys wished to prove she was attentive to even the lowliest of her subjects. She weighed the arguments in a measured tone, mindful that these small folk had suffered dearly during the War of the Five Kings. At last, she issued a compromise. Lord Rosby would retain the land by law, but he must lease parcels to the small folk at a fair rate, overseen by the crown's steward, until they could find permanent homesteads elsewhere. She appended a stern warning that any lord who exploited refugees would be called to account, as if the queen herself had been wronged. Some knights and lords bristled at her direct interference in what they considered private feudal matters, but none dared voice strong objections. To defy Daenerys Targaryen now was to risk Dragonfire, and the memory of Drogon looming above the Red Keep remained fresh in every pair of eyes that had witnessed that day. When court ended, Daenerys stood and stretched, every muscle in her body sore from sitting so long on the monstrous throne. Ser Jorah Mormont approached, offering her a quiet word. "You are doing well, your grace," he said in his gruff voice, keeping it low so others would not overhear. "The lords might squabble, but they cannot deny your authority. Once the realm settles, you may not need to spend quite so many hours in these petty disputes. They are only petty to those who have not lost their homes," Daenerys replied, though kindly. "I won't let my lords forget who is truly suffering because of their wars." Jorah bowed in acceptance. She could see pride in his eyes, mingled with concern for her well-being. In truth, he was not wrong about the exhaustion. But Daenerys could not bring herself to ignore the small folks' cries for justice simply because she was weary. She glanced at the throne, a looming shape of black metal. How many kings had sat there ignoring their people's plight until the realm boiled over in revolt? The Targaryens had once been beloved, feared, and obeyed in nearly equal measure until they were not. She intended to avoid the mistakes of her forebears. That evening, she walked the ramparts of the Red Keep to clear her head. The city stretched before her in rolling hills of lantern light and flickering torches. Beyond the walls, the Blackwater rush glimmered under the moon. Drogon roosted on one of the towers. No rampart or stable could truly hold him. When Daenerys passed him, she paused to run her hand along his warm flank. He stirred, lowering his massive head so she could touch the ridges of his snout. She spoke softly in Valyrian, words of affection that came as naturally to her now as breathing. He had grown again, even in these short weeks of relative peace. She could scarcely believe it sometimes. His wingspan might have exceeded 100 feet months ago. Now it looked closer to 150 or more. He cast an enormous shadow whenever he took flight. When the sun shone, it often seemed that the entire courtyard below fell under darkness if he passed overhead. And indeed, the enchantments she had laid upon him and his siblings, ancient rites traced from the fragments of Valyrian glyphs she had collected, rendered them something more than mere living creatures. They were impervious to all mundane weapons known. Stormcrows, second sons, and Sellswords from Essos had tested arrowheads, bolts, even poison-laced harpoons. All failed. Westerosi scorpions, improved by Qyburn and cunning ironmongers, had shattered on impact against scales as hard as forged steel. Not even the rumored dragon-killing ballistas of the old Targaryen civil war, the dance of the dragons, would have been enough to pierce them. Some whispered that only magic could harm them now. Daenerys did not know if that was entirely true, but she was certain enough that no ordinary foe could threaten her children. Both men and women across the land repeated the rumor that these dragons surpassed even Balerion the Black Dread in size. Indeed, no living memory contained a creature so colossal. Maesters quietly began to rewrite their treatises. And though part of Daenerys felt exultant at the knowledge that her might was absolute, another part whispered caution. The more unstoppable she appeared, the more fear might drive conspiracies in the dark. She continued along the ramparts, heading toward a staircase that would take her down to the courtyard. She'd arranged a small gathering in the Great Hall that evening to introduce newly arrived lords from the Crownlands, men who had lingered on the sidelines during the war, to her key advisors. With her counsel, she would solidify the region's loyalty and ensure no holdfast remained a secret den of rebellion. As she passed beneath a flickering torch sconce, Varys stepped from the shadows, wearing a gown of shimmering violet silk, hands folded in front of his ample stomach. "Your Grace," he said in that soft, genial tone. "Might I have a moment of your time?" "Of course, Lord Varys," Daenerys replied. The Master of Whisperers, once the Spider, had returned to the Red Keep quietly after her conquest, just as he had promised when he'd first conspired to aid her. She found him invaluable, if unnerving. Varys fell into step beside her. "You look tired, my queen," he observed politely. "Ruling such a battered kingdom must be taxing." Daenerys allowed a faint smile. "A lesser burden than I expected, in truth. The great lords and small folk alike are too weary of war to resist a queen who offers stability. So far, anyway." "Indeed," Varys said. "Yet I would caution your grace that pockets of unrest remain. Certain lords blame you for humiliating their banners. Others have lost kin in the dragonfires outside Harrenhal and the Trident. The memory of the war is still fresh, and resentments fester in times of peace, just as easily as they fester in times of strife. I've heard disturbing reports from the Stormlands. Discontent stirs there among some of Stannis Baratheon's old supporters. Word is, they speak of a rightful Baratheon heir, though none remain except for Gendry, the unacknowledged bastard. And if rumors of Edric Storm's survival are true, that is another matter." Daenerys considered this as she descended the stone steps. The memory of scorching Stannis outside Dragonstone still left a bitter taste in her mouth, even if it had been necessary. "Any threat to my rule will soon learn the futility of raising arms," she said. "But I do not intend to punish them for grumbling in private. If they stand openly against me, that's a different matter." Varys nodded. "Just so, your grace. A gentle reminder. Keep your eyes open. Not every plot is as direct as open rebellion. Poison remains as deadly as dragon. Fire, if given in the right measure and at the right time." Daenerys inclined her head. "I'll keep that in mind. Thank you, Lord Varys." They parted ways in the courtyard, where the torches fluttered in the night breeze. As Daenerys headed inside, she decided to check on her other two dragons, Regal and Viserion, who often roost outside the city walls at night, hunting in the fields or sleeping in the ruins of old outbuildings near the coastline. The scarlet sky at dusk had shown them winging out in search of prey. They might return with deer or half-charred goats. She felt the distant bond with them, a comforting hum at the back of her mind. They were content, well-fed, prowling the dark skies like living storms. Stepping into the great hall, she found Tyrion Lannister already entertaining a handful of noble guests. Clad in fine black silk, the dwarf stood near a table of wine and pears, weaving a charming web of half-truths and jesting insults as only Tyrion could. He caught her eye and winked before draining a cup. Laughter rippled among the gathered lords. Tyrion had become Daenerys' master of coin, unofficially at first, then formally when she realized his capacity for finances, negotiations, and diplomacy. It amused her to see how the other lords responded to him, with a mixture of curiosity, wariness, and grudging respect. His father, Tywin, had once overshadowed every aspect of Lannister power, but the old lion was now kept on a short leash, carefully watched by Daenerys' loyal officers. Tyrion, by contrast, had proven his loyalty in small but significant ways, from back-channeling with the Tyrells to quietly coordinating the city's finances. "I do hear that dragons can cause quite the trouble for one's roof," Tyrion was saying to a stout lord from Crackclaw Point, who wore a fur cloak despite the mild night. "But on the bright side, their droppings are said to be a potent fertilizer. Shall I put you in touch with the master of the king's or queen's stables to see about procuring some for your fields?" The lord blinked in confusion. I suppose?" Tyrion lifted an eyebrow. "No? Yes? I can't tell if that was an acceptance or a refusal." The man began to sputter, and the small knot of lords erupted in awkward laughter. Daenerys approached, and the men bowed hastily. Tyrion offered her a quick grin. "Your Grace, I was just discussing the many uses of dragons beyond mere devastation." "You should be grateful," Daenerys said with a faint smile, "that my dragons eat well outside the city walls. I doubt your roofs are in danger, unless you cross me, of course." There was a strained moment of silence, and then a wave of forced chuckles as the lords realized the queen had made a jest. Daenerys allowed the tension to dissipate, gesturing for them to stand at ease. She spoke a few pleasantries, learning their names, hearing their concerns about brigands, roads that still needed repairs, and taxes that lingered from the Lannister demands. Promising she would address these matters in council, she invited them to partake of the evening's refreshments. As they drifted away, Tyrion sidled closer to Daenerys. "You have a talent for these gatherings, though I suspect you'd rather be anywhere else." "I'd rather be riding Drogon to the Dothraki Sea," Daenerys admitted. "But that life is over. This is my new path." Tyrion studied her face. "It's not a bad path, Your Grace. You're shaping the realm with every decision, one might say, forging a new order. Dragons aside, that might be your true legacy." She nodded thoughtfully. "If it brings peace to these lands, then I'll consider it worth the effort." Yet in the pit of her stomach, she felt a subtle dread. She had always craved the Iron Throne, thinking it would be the end of her journey, the culmination of her birthright. In truth, it was only the beginning of an even more arduous road. By the time the gathering ended, Daenerys felt the slow burn of fatigue behind her eyes. She offered Tyrion a final nod and left the hall. Outside in the corridor, Grey Worm awaited her with his unsullied, ever vigilant. The leader of her elite guard was as stoic as ever, though she had seen him smile a bit more often of late. She marveled at how much had changed since she had first freed him in Astapor. That felt like a different lifetime, a different world. She was about to head for her chambers when a messenger raced in. A young boy wearing the colors of House Stark. The child was breathless, pale with awe to find himself addressing the queen. He bowed awkwardly and managed to gasp out, "A letter from the hand of the king in the north, Your Grace, Lord Robb Stark." Daenerys took the small parchment and dismissed the boy, who darted off after another hasty bow. She broke the seal, a direwolf's head in gray wax, and scanned the contents by the light of a nearby lantern. The words were hurried, almost frantic. Robb Stark wrote, "Your Grace, winter comes swiftly. My rangers near the wall bring troubling reports. The Night's Watch has encountered undead creatures, wights, in growing numbers. Wildlings speak of White Walkers, call them others, claim they bring the cold and raise the dead. I have sent men to investigate, but many do not return. What few rangers do escape come back whispering of unstoppable foes. If you recall what I said when we parleyed, the North fears a threat beyond mortal kings. Now, I fear it is no mere rumor. We need men, resources, and perhaps your dragons, if the rumors of their imperviousness are true. The Night's Watch begs assistance. You hold the realm in your hand. Please, do not let us face this darkness alone. It was signed with a flourish, Robb Stark, Warden of the North. Daenerys read it twice, her stomach twisting. The realm had only just found a precarious peace, and now an even graver threat loomed. She remembered hearing whispers in Essos about the Long Night, an ancient cataclysm that the Red Priests sometimes spoke of, how darkness and ice creatures had nearly destroyed the world. Could it be more than a legend? She recalled Samwell Tarly from the Night's Watch. She had met him briefly in Meereen once, or so rumor said, but that memory was hazy. She was certain she had gleaned tidbits from many travelers who spoke of the Wall. All described it as the last bastion against whatever lay in the far north. She closed her eyes, recalling her vow to become the queen for all, one who would not ignore threats just because they lay outside the typical Game of Thrones. War with the dead sounded so implausible, but she had seen sorcery enough to know the world bristled with dark powers. The warlocks of Karth, the Shadowbinders of Ash-High, the priests of R'hllor, if they existed, why not these others? If there truly was a nightmarish force that raised the dead, what mere sword could stand against them? She knew the answer, dragonfire. If these creatures hated fire, then the living flame of dragons might be the only sure defense. But the North was far away, and the realm was not yet stable enough to withstand the Queen's prolonged absence, unless she entrusted it to others. She walked to her chambers with her guards, letter in hand, her thoughts churning. The comfortable warmth of the room did little to soothe her as she settled at a small desk. Missandei, her ever-faithful translator and confidant, appeared at her side, silent as a shadow. "You seem troubled, Your Grace." Daenerys rubbed her temples. "A message from Robb Stark, a dire threat in the far north, beyond the Wall. Stories of the dead walking. He begs for aid." Missandei's dark eyes widened. "Such stories have come to me as well, in half-truths from travelers. They say an endless winter marches south." Daenerys nodded. "Yes, and I know not whether half these tales are superstition, but the letters from the Night's Watch are consistent." She drummed her fingers on the desk. "If this threat is real, ignoring it would be folly. If it is exaggerated, sending my entire might north could create chaos in the south. Some might see it as weakness or a chance to rebel." Missandei offered softly, "You must choose whom to trust, my queen." Robb Stark bent the knee in good faith. "I cannot believe he would fabricate such claims." Daenerys exhaled, leaning back. "I don't believe he would. Robb Stark is too straightforward for that, and the Watch has no reason to lie." She looked down at her hands. For so long, the War of the Five Kings had seemed the greatest threat to Westeros, and now that war was over. But a new war threatened, one beyond the petty ambitions of mortal men. Could it be that her destiny was not simply to sit the Iron Throne, but to defend all living souls from an otherworldly menace? She remembered the house words, fire and blood, fire to conquer, fire to protect. Rising, she moved to the window. The night sky was clear, and in the distance, she heard a roar that must have come from R'hllor or Viserion returning to the city's outskirts. She made a decision then. She would not sit idle while the dead closed in. She would answer the call, but she would also ensure the South remained in firm hands. The next morning, she summoned her council. Tyrion, Jorah, Grey Worm, Varys, and a handful of others including Davos Seaworth, who had found his way to her service after Stannis' fall. His loyalty rooted in the realm's welfare above all else. She read them Robb's letter, noting the lines about whites and White Walkers. The varied expressions around the table reflected shock, disbelief, and worry. Tyrion stroked his beard thoughtfully. Jorah frowned, glancing at Daenerys. Varys wore his usual mask of polite intrigue, while Grey Worm stood impassively, focusing only on strategy. Davos's mouth tightened, as though he had suspected something like this all along. Tyrion broke the silence. White Walkers, the ancient boogeymen of the North. I always assumed they were myths, or at best a cautionary tale. He turned to Davos. Did Stannis ever speak of such things? Davos nodded. He received ravens from the Night's Watch. He gave them little heed, or at least he couldn't spare the attention after his defeat on the Blackwater. But yes, I believe they truly exist, or else the Watch has gone mad collectively. Yora shifted, arms crossed. Your Grace, even if these others are real, sending the bulk of our forces north is a risk. Not everyone in the south is loyal. We have reports of possible unrest in Dorne, the Stormlands, and some reavers among the Ironborn might take advantage of your absence. Daenerys took a slow breath. I know. That is why I won't simply march north blindly. I will leave a firm regent in King's Landing. My presence, and that of at least one dragon, must go north, though. We can't fight an enemy of ice and death with mundane steel. If these creatures are impervious to normal blades, as the old stories say, then we need dragonfire to stop them. Grey Worm spoke, his voice calm and measured. I will follow wherever you lead, Your Grace. If the foe is in the north, we can march. But how can we fight them if they raise the dead to fight again? Daenerys looked around, conscious of how extraordinary this conversation was. Once, they had all been locked in a war of ambitions. Now they spoke of an undead legion. We must gather more information, she said. Tyrion, Davos, see if we can glean more detail from the archives, from any old texts on the Long Night. We need to know these creatures' weaknesses and strengths beyond rumor. Yora, begin preparations for a northern expedition. Gather volunteers from the northern lords stationed nearby. They'll know the terrain. Grey Worm, place extra patrols around the city. Keep watch for saboteurs. Varys, I want your little birds to track any sign of rebellion or sabotage. They all affirmed their tasks, though Daenerys noted the undercurrent of unease. Even the strongest military strategy falters against an enemy that breaks the rules of life and death. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she would be leading many of these men to their doom. Then she pushed aside that doubt. She was the mother of dragons, the conqueror of the Seven Kingdoms, and she would not abandon the realm to a horror beyond the wall. In the following days, word spread of the Queen's intention to journey north. Ravens flapped from the red, keep to every corner of Westeros, carrying messages that the Night's Watch had asked for aid against a monstrous threat. Daenerys' plan was bold. She would bring a portion of her Unsullied, a contingent of knights from the Crownlands, and a select group of volunteers from each region so they could witness the threat firsthand. She would also bring Drogon, and possibly one of his siblings, depending on what Tyrion or Davos might uncover about how best to use dragonfire against an icy foe. She refused to leave all 3 dragons in King's Landing, but she also refused to remove them all. If a rebellion flared in her absence, the mere presence of even one dragon at the capital would deter it. The day of departure came sooner than many expected. Outside the city gates, lines of mounted knights, unsullied infantry, supply wagons, and outriders stretched across the dusty road. Banners bearing the Targaryen 3-headed dragon fluttered in the wind. At Daenerys' command, that banner flew alongside the Stark direwolf and the sigil of the Night's Watch, a black field. This alliance of South and North, living souls bound by necessity, underscored just how far the realm had come from the fractious war of the 5 kings. Now that conflict seemed trivial in comparison to a threat that did not care which house you served or which king you bent the knee to. Daenerys herself wore practical leathers beneath a heavy black cloak trimmed with wolf fur, a gift from Robb Stark, intended to keep her warm in the harsh northern climate. As she climbed onto Drogon's back, she felt the usual surge of adrenaline and fierce pride. He snorted, a great plume of smoke billowing from his nostrils. Knights and soldiers blanched, as they always did, at the raw presence of such a beast. By her side, Rhaegal waited with one of her blood riders, Jogo, who had become adept at guiding the green and bronze dragon. Viserion stayed behind in King's Landing, perched near the Red Keep under the watchful eyes of her other blood riders. If a true uprising rose in her absence, Viserion could reduce any rebellious stronghold to cinders in a matter of hours. That knowledge gave her some comfort as she prepared to leave the capital. Tyrion watched from below, a small figure among the columns of soldiers. He would remain in King's Landing as Hand of the Queen, a title she had granted him after much deliberation. He had come a long way since their first meeting in Meereen. Standing next to him was Grey Worm, who would keep order in the city with the Unsullied. Missandei was torn. Part of her wished to remain at Daenerys' side, but she had become indispensable in King's Landing, bridging the new laws and edicts with her flawless command of tongues and her unwavering loyalty. Davos Seaworth, on the other hand, had volunteered to go north, citing his knowledge of northern terrain from his smuggling days and his desire to protect the realm from any threat. Daenerys found his practicality and honesty reassuring, so it was that she led her host northward. Drogon soared above, occasionally swooping low to keep the column in sight, while Rhaegal flew slightly behind or veered off to scout the terrain. The first leg of the journey was relatively pleasant. The Crownlands gave way to rolling hills and farmland. Though the war had scarred much of the region, signs of recovery were visible. Fields replanted, small villages rebuilt. People turned out to see the passing of the Queen's army, gaping at the sight of dragons overhead. Some cheered. Others simply stared in awe. As days passed, the weather grew colder. The roads grew more rugged. They crossed the Neck, the narrow causeway where the boggy terrain and thick forests gave them a sense of how difficult it could be to move a large army north. But their force was not massive. Daenerys had purposely kept it lean to move faster. Enough men to defend themselves if some northern house turned treacherous, but not so large as to slow them or exhaust their supply lines. She counted on House Stark's hospitality to replenish provisions as they traveled. Eventually, they neared Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that guarded the entrance to the north. Its thick walls and haunting towers loomed over the swampy land, battered by millennia of war and weather. On the ramparts, Stark banners now flew, not the flayed man of House Bolton that had once claimed it. The sight was comforting. They were officially in the north now. Robb Stark awaited them in the courtyard, clad in a heavy fur cloak, the direwolf sigil emblazoned on his surcoat. Beside him was a massive gray direwolf, Grey Wind, who bared his teeth at the dragons overhead but did not advance. Daenerys commanded Drogon to land outside the walls, to avoid damaging the old stones that might crumble under his weight. She dismounted gracefully, aided by a rope ladder. Drogon hissed, swirling smoke from his nostrils, but remained calm under her touch. She felt the tension in the air. The northern men on the walls had seen dragons only from a distance before. Confronted with Drogon's monstrous size, bigger than some small keeps, they could do nothing but stand in shock. As Daenerys approached, Robb strode forward, meeting her with a stiff half-bow. "Your Grace, you've come sooner than I dared hope." She smiled thinly, giving him a respectful nod. "I would not ignore your summons, my lord. The threat you describe concerns us all. These are my men, loyal and prepared to fight. Shall we speak inside?" They retired to Moat Cailin's ancient Great Hall, a drafty chamber lit by torches. The rough-hewn walls bore the scars of centuries of battles. Robb's bannermen gathered in a semicircle. Daenerys' retinue did the same on the opposite side, including Ser Jorah, Davos, and a handful of knights. Robb wasted no time. Reports from beyond the wall grow grimmer by the day. The dead swarm, the Night Fort, and Eastwatch, no longer just wildling rumors. The rangers who survive say they've seen entire villages of free folk turned into whites. The Watch tries to hold the wall, but the cold intensifies. Frost and ice creep across the land. We've never seen a winter like this, and it hasn't even truly begun. My uncle, Benjen Stark, vanished beyond the wall years ago. Some say he yet lives. Others say he's lost among the dead. Either way, the Watch is outnumbered and undersupplied. They cannot stand alone. A Stark bannerman to Robb's left, a tall man with gray in his beard, spoke up, voice thick with northern gravel. "Begging your pardon, your grace, But how can dragons and southern knights fight a foe that does not bleed, that does not fear death? Daenerys answered calmly, "Fire. Whether they bleed or not, they will burn. My dragons can unleash enough flame to incinerate entire columns of whites, if needed. But we must be smart. The North's climate may hamper normal armies. We should coordinate with the Night's Watch to lure these creatures into positions where dragons can strike effectively. Otherwise, we risk exhaustion and attrition." Davos folded his arms. "We'll need dragonglass as well, if the old stories are correct. The children of the forest used it in the long night. I hear there's plenty of that in the caves beneath Dragonstone, though that's quite a ways away now. And rumor says Valyrian steel might help, if you can find any." Robb nodded, looking solemn. "Yes, Samwell Tarly Wr. Owe me about dragonglass. The Night's Watch has some, but not enough to outfit an army. Perhaps we can send a ship south to gather more from Dragonstone, or arrange caravans to bring it here." Daenerys recognized that time was of the essence. "We'll do so immediately," she said. "But we won't wait. Let's press on to Winterfell. We'll make our war camp there. It's more defensible and better supplied. Once we establish a base, we can send envoys to the Wall or ride there ourselves. My dragons can make the journey in a matter of hours, but I want to ensure the rest of our forces are well positioned." None could disagree. Moat Cailin was too ruinous and ill-provisioned to host a large force. The next morning, they set out northward again. The land grew harsher. The wind carried a sharper bite. Winter was indeed coming, though snows had not yet fallen in earnest. A chilling frost coated the ground by dawn. Trees stood stark and lifeless, skeletal arms raised to a pale sky. Daenerys found herself glad for the thick furs Robb had provided. Many of her knights, unaccustomed to such cold, shivered despite layers of wool and leather. Still, they pressed on, determined. They crossed the plains and woods that led to Winterfell, passing villages and holdfasts that had known devastation under the Ironborn and the Boltons. It lifted Daenerys' heart to see them slowly recovering. Houses that had sworn to Robb Stark lined the roads, offering provisions and joining the march with their own small levies. Daenerys greeted them graciously, letting them see that she was no foreign tyrant, but a queen willing to stand with them against any threat. Some looked at her with suspicion, but others showed a flicker of reverence, especially when Drogon or Rhaegal passed overhead. Fear and awe hand in hand. At last, Winterfell's gray walls appeared on the horizon. Even from a distance, Daenerys sensed a somber grandeur in the castle's silhouette. Its towers rose against the clouded sky, formidable and grim. The outer gates stood open, revealing the courtyard beyond, filled with Stark men busily preparing for war. The repairs to Winterfell, damaged in the war, were largely complete, though scaffolding still clung to some walls. The hot springs that ran beneath the fortress sent tendrils of steam curling into the frigid air, offering a surprising warmth inside the keep. Daenerys ordered the bulk of her army to pitch tents outside the walls, in a new encampment. Only her advisors and closest guards would stay within the castle proper, so as not to strain the Stark larders. Robb insisted she claim the Lord's chambers, but she refused, preferring to remain near her troops in an adjoining tower suite. She recognized the courtesy, but she did not want to displace the young lord from his own seat. That first night at Winterfell, a great feast was laid in the hall, though it was modest by southern standards. Tables groaned with roast boar, venison stew, and black bread, with pitchers of strong ale and mead. Robb Stark formally welcomed Daenerys and her retinue. Sansa Stark was also in attendance, returned from the turmoil in King's Landing some moons ago, or so the rumors said. She greeted Daenerys courteously, though with a hint of caution. Her auburn hair was bound in a thick braid, and she wore a simple yet elegant gown of gray wool. The courtesy in her voice concealed a quiet strength. "We've heard much of your dragons, your grace," Sansa said as Daenerys took a seat of honor at the head table. "I saw them once, from a distance, in King's Landing, but never so close. They are far larger than I imagined." Daenerys offered a small smile. "They continue to grow. I've made sure they harm no one who does not threaten us." Sansa nodded, glancing around the hall. Perhaps it is a blessing they came when they did. We have many threats now, and the people need hope. Daenerys sensed the undercurrent in her words. Perhaps the memory of losing her parents, of betrayal by the Lannisters, had taught Sansa caution. Yet the fact that she sat here at all, openly in the seat of House Stark, was a testament to Robb's resilience and the realm's new shape under Daenerys' rule. The feast continued, though the mood was subdued. In hushed tones, the talk inevitably turned to the undead. Stories circulated about entire patrols of the Night's Watch disappearing in the haunted forests. Some men drank heavily, trying to bolster courage or dismiss their anxieties. A bard played a mournful tune on the lute, strumming a ballad about the long night that once lasted a generation. Daenerys found the ominous words curling around her heart. Later, in a quieter corner of the hall, she conferred with Robb, Davos, and a few other key lords. Lord Umber, Lord Glover, Lord Manderley. They spread out a map on a rough wooden table. Robb tapped a spot at the very top. Castle Black here. To the west is the Shadow Tower. To the east is Eastwatch by the Sea. The watch is stretched thin. The largest force of free folk is said to be near Hardhome, far to the northeast. There the ones we suspect have been turned by the Whites. Davos frowned, running a finger across the mountainous terrain. So if the others can pass around the edge of the wall, by sea or by climbing the Frostfangs, Castle Black might be bypassed. The Night's Watch can't be everywhere. Daenerys studied the scale of the map. We could send dragons to scout. Drogon and Rhaegal can cover more ground in a single day than an army can in a week. If we locate the largest concentration of undead, we can plan a strike. But we risk the dragons if these others have some unknown power. I do not believe they can match Valyrian sorcery, yet we cannot be certain. Melisandre conjured shadows that could not pierce my dragon's scales. But that does not mean every magic will fail. One of the northern lords cleared his throat. Begging your pardon, your grace, but the old tales say the others ride dead horses, command snow and ice. They bring storms that freeze men's blood in their veins, and they can shatter steel with a touch. We might want to test them in smaller skirmishes before committing the main host. Robb gave the man a nod. Wise counsel. We must see what we're truly dealing with. We can't charge blindly. In a few days' time, perhaps we can send a scouting party north of the wall with a small retinue to capture, or kill, one of these Whites. Bring proof back so no one in the south can deny it. Daenerys remembered the political reality that still lingered behind them. Many lords south of the Neck might not truly believe in the undead threat. If they thought it was a trick for the North to gain power or an excuse for Daenerys to keep her army mobilized, they might refuse to send reinforcements. A living White would be incontrovertible proof that the war they faced was real. She closed her eyes, exhaling. So many games, even in the face of apocalypse. Very well, she said. We'll assemble a small group. I'll send Rhaegal to watch from the skies. If the others appear in force, the scouts can withdraw behind Dragonfire. Or if the opportunity presents itself, we might manage to capture a White. But I want no man taking foolish risks. My advisors, your best trackers, and a small escort, no more than a handful. The rest of the host will remain here, preparing fortifications. If we confirm the threat is as dire as it seems, we'll need to move swiftly. They all agreed. In the following days, the courtyard of Winterfell echoed with the ring of steel and the shouts of men training. The blacksmiths worked overtime forging spears, swords, and arrowheads. Some maesters labored to combine dragonglass shards from the Watch's limited supply with metal for new weapons. Meanwhile, Daenerys often stood atop the walls, gazing north, her breath visible in the biting wind. Sometimes Drogon circled overhead, a living furnace in the cold sky, a stark contrast to the creeping chill that seemed to invade her bones. She had never known real winter. In Essos, she had endured scorching deserts and raging seas. But this was a different enemy, a slow, unyielding tide of cold. The gloom weighed on her. She found herself thinking of her father and his talk of burning everything. Perhaps he had glimpsed some prophecy? Or was she simply reading meaning where there was madness? She also remembered her own experiences with the warlocks of Karth, the House of the Undying. They had shown her visions, some cryptic warnings about a darkness beyond the wall. She had almost dismissed them as part of the illusions that tried to entrap her. Now she wondered how much had been truth. Robb's sister, Sansa, approached Daenerys one afternoon as the queen walked the ramparts, studying the bleak horizon. Sansa's steps were tentative, but there was a new confidence in her posture, as though she had decided to speak her mind. "Your Grace," she said, dipping a quick curtsy. Daenerys nodded in greeting. "Lady Sansa." They stood side by side for a moment, the wind tugging at their cloaks. Sansa's cheeks were reddened by the cold. She clasped her hands, glancing up at Drogon as he soared lazily overhead. "I wanted to thank you for coming. Many southern rulers would not heed the call of the Night's Watch, even if my brother asked them personally. You did." Daenerys offered a faint smile. "I wish I could say it was purely selfless, but the truth is, if the dead overrun the north, the rest of the realm will eventually fall. I am queen of all 7 kingdoms, so it is my duty to defend them." Sansa studied her. Duty or no, it took courage. And you must have your own concerns, rebellions, the demands of ruling. Yet you came. I lost faith in kings when my father was executed. I lost faith in the throne when Joffrey tormented me. It's still strange to me that another Targaryen rules after everything. But I see now you might be different from the rest. Daenerys hesitated. "I never knew your father, but from all accounts, he was an honorable man who sought the good of the realm. This realm could use more men like him. And women," she added with a slight curve of her lips. Sansa's eyes flicked away, a distant sorrow passing over her features, perhaps recalling her father's final moments. "I only hope we can survive what's coming." Daenerys placed a hand lightly on the young woman's shoulder. "We will. The North is strong and so are we. The dead are an abomination, but they can be destroyed. You have my word. I won't abandon Winterfell or the Night's Watch to face this alone." Sansa gave a small nod, something like gratitude in her eyes. Then she excused herself, leaving Daenerys to the chill wind and her own thoughts. Time pressed on. At last, the scouting party was assembled. Ser Jorah insisted on going, as did Davos, claiming his knowledge of the crags and coasts might help. Robb chose several of his best trackers and fighters, men like Lord Beric Dondarrion, recently come north from the Riverlands, telling tales of a flaming sword and service to the Lord of Light. Jon Umber, a bear of a man with a booming voice, volunteered as well. It seemed half the northern lords wanted to join, but Daenerys made them draw back, limiting the party to a dozen. The plan was simple. They would ride north of the wall, guided by a band of experienced rangers from the Watch, with Rhaegal circling overhead. They would attempt to draw a small group of whites into an ambush, kill or capture one, then retreat. On a cold morning, Daenerys and Robb stood in the courtyard to see the party off. The men checked their gear under the watchful eye of the Black brothers who had come south from Castle Black, led by a grizzled ranger named Dolorous Ed. Rhaegal perched on a massive patch of ground near the gates, wings half-furled, already making the horses skittish. Davos bowed before Daenerys. "Wish me luck, your grace. I'll bring you back a nice dead man for proof, if it pleases you." She managed a wry smile. "Be careful, Lord Davos. I value your counsel too much to lose you to the undead. And you as well, Jorah," she added, turning to her oldest companion. Jorah placed a hand over his heart. "I will do my duty, my queen. If I do not return." "Don't speak of that." Daenerys cut him off, swallowing. She had lost too many dear friends on this journey. "Return, Jorah. That is an order." A flicker of a smile passed between them. Davos and Jorah swung up onto their horses. The gates rumbled open, revealing the snow-dusted road beyond. Rhaegal gave a shriek that rattled the walls. In a flurry of beating wings, the green dragon took flight, ascending into the gray sky. The scouting party rode out, each face set in grim determination, following the swirling gusts of Rhaegal's powerful wing beats northward. Daenerys watched them until they vanished beyond a ridge, a heavy sensation clinging to her chest. She wanted to be with them, to see for herself the danger beyond the wall. But she knew a queen's duty was to lead the main force, to hold Winterfell and coordinate the realm's defense. If the scouting party succeeded, they would confirm everything. If they failed, well, she would have to plan the next step regardless. In the meantime, more ravens arrived from the south. House Tyrell reported that the harvest was good. They could send grain north if needed. That was a relief. But another message suggested that pockets of outlaws in the Stormlands were stirring trouble. The lords loyal to Daenerys had suppressed them for now, yet it was a reminder that she was fighting a war on two fronts, one against mortal malcontents, another against a timeless evil. She felt the weight of the crown more acutely than ever. 3 days later, a horn's cry sounded near midday, echoing across Winterfell's courtyard. Daenerys, in the middle of discussing supply lines with Robb, halted. She glanced toward the gates. Their riders approached at speed, ragged and stumbling. Even from a distance, she recognized Ser Jorah's frame, listing in the saddle, and Davos holding the reins with white-knuckled urgency. A hush fell over the courtyard as men rushed to help them. Regal swooped overhead, battered and screeching, a patch of frost clinging to his wings. Daenerys ran forward, ignoring the cold that bit her cheeks. She reached Jorah's horse as he half collapsed, fumbling for the ground. Davos slid out of his saddle, limping. Around them, the handful of survivors from the scouting party arrived. Some had fresh wounds, others looked half-frozen. Many were missing. Robb appeared on the spot, face drawn in alarm. What happened? Jorah coughed, wincing, his breath ragged. Ambush. Sea cold like I've never felt. The whites, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They came at us from all sides. We tried to lure only a few, but they swarmed. We lost half the party, maybe more. Davos's voice trembled. They have monstrous creatures among them, not just men. Giants, bears, all dead, all unstoppable. Regal burned many, but they kept coming. We barely escaped. What of the proof? Daenerys pressed, though her heart clenched at the mention of so many lost. She saw Beric Dondarrion among the survivors, his face grim, a chunk of flesh torn from his arm. Did you capture one? Davos nodded shakily. We did. It's in a cage on a sledge behind us. Lost 2 men carrying the thrice-cursed thing, but we have it. Or we did, last I checked. At that moment, 2 exhausted rangers coaxed a pair of horses forward, dragging a wooden sledge. The cage atop it shook violently, black iron rattling. Inside was a figure that had once been a man, now a twisted, rotting husk with icy blue eyes. Its mouth gaped in silent hunger, fingers clawing through the bars. Every time it touched the iron, frost crackled, as if the air around it dropped by 10 degrees. The men around it instinctively backed away, horror plain on their faces. A hush fell over the courtyard. Even the Northmen, who had half believed in such creatures, drew back in shock. Daenerys stepped closer, heart pounding. She locked eyes on the white and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. This truly was death animated, a perversion of life. As it sensed her presence, it let out a guttural hiss and hurled itself against the bars, skeletal jaws snapping. She could see scraps of ragged flesh clinging to bone, and a black iciness swirling in the vacant sockets. Jorah caught her arm. Be careful, Your Grace. It's dangerous, even in the cage. She nodded mutely. Slowly, she approached, until she was a few paces away. The white flailed, scraping its nails across the iron. Daenerys drew in a steadying breath. This was real. The threat was real. No more talk of illusions or trickery. If this was but one of thousands, they were in dire peril indeed. Robb joined her, face grim. We can't fight an army of these alone, he said quietly. Not even with dragons, if there are truly thousands, tens of thousands. My watchers say more gather each day. The wildlings flee south, but the whites follow. Daenerys forced a calm exterior as she looked at him. Then we must rally the entire realm. Every house, every corner, must join us or perish. I'll take this thing south if need be to prove the danger. But we must also prepare for them here. The wall might not hold forever. She glanced at the cage again, saw the White's dead eyes fix on her. A cold fury kindled in her chest. These abominations threatened all she had fought for. She was done with petty wars. This would be a war for the living, and she would not hide behind castle walls. She turned to a cluster of men around them. "Burn it," she commanded. "But do so outside the walls. I'll see for myself how quickly it falls to dragon fire." The men hesitated, clearly terrified at the idea of removing it from its cage. Davos intervened, pushing aside the crowd. "I'll help. If it tries to break free, we'll end it right there." "I'm coming," Daenerys said, ignoring Yora's protests. "I have to see this. We'll put it on display for the realm if we must. But for now, let's confirm it has no defense against fire." Men surrounded the cage with spears, herding it away from the courtyard, out into an open space by the walls. The White thrashed and hissed, a series of eerie gurgles issuing from its throat. Daenerys followed, calling Drogon. The black dragon soared overhead, answering her silent command. A wave of awe radiated through the watching soldiers. When they reached a safe distance, Daenerys signaled the men back. Only Davos, Yora, and a few watchers remained close. The caged White rattled, scraping at the iron bars. Daenerys looked up at Drogon, nodded once. The dragon inhaled, chest expanding, and unleashed a torrent of bright orange flame. The heat rolled across the ground in a wave, setting the cage ablaze instantly. The White screeched, thrashing in agony. For a moment, it clawed at the bars, as if trying to escape. Then it disintegrated into ash, leaving only twisted bits of metal behind. A hush fell once more. The watchers exhaled in relief. Davos shook his head grimly. "At least they burn." Daenerys clenched her fists. "They do. But how many more are there? Thousands? Tens of thousands?" She turned to Yora, who still breathed heavily from his injuries. "Rest, heal. You've done well, all of you. We'll need to plan now, not just for the north, but for the entire realm." She gazed at the blackened remnants of the cage. Fear and determination warred within her. She had conquered the War of the Five Kings with unstoppable dragons, had ended petty squabbles in a blaze of fiery conquest. But this was not a mortal war. No cunning tactic or stroke of a sword would suffice if an endless tide of the dead marched on them, and they were not all mindless. At their head, she'd heard rumors, were the White Walkers themselves, beings of living ice, the masters who commanded the Whites. In that moment, she resolved that if she had to muster every last resource, every drop of Valyrian power at her disposal, she would do it. For if the living failed to unite, everything she had built, and everything these people had cherished for generations, would be lost to a darkness beyond imagining. That night, Daenerys called a great council in the great hall of Winterfell. By torchlight and candle, she stood at the head of a long table. Robb Stark and his northern lords lined one side, her own knights and advisors on the other. Representatives of the Night's Watch took seats near the head. Tension lay thick in the air. Many kept glancing at the corner, where that blackened cage was placed as a grim reminder of what they faced. Davos's eyes looked hollow, and Yora's face was taut with pain. Daenerys lifted her hands, silence falling in an instant. "You have all seen the proof. We face an army of the dead, led by these White Walkers. Fire can destroy their whites, but we do not know if dragonfire alone can slay the walkers themselves. We must gather dragonglass from Dragonstone. We must call the banners of every house in Westeros, from Dorne to the Wall. This is no time for old enmities. I will send ravens to every lord, commanding them to march north with whatever forces they can spare. Any who refuse are dooming themselves. I will also write to the Citadel, demanding the maesters share any knowledge they have on the Long Night and the others. Let them keep no secret." Robb Stark took a step forward. "The North will fight. Every able-bodied man, woman, and youth who can wield a blade or bow will muster here and at the wall. My sister Sansa will oversee Winterfell's defenses while we plan the next moves. Some will stay behind to protect the castle if the lines break. Others will ride to Castle Black. A deeply bearded Lord Manderley from White Harbor nodded. "We'll sail up the eastern coast, bring men from the Vale if they'll come, and from the other corners of the realm." Daenerys let out a breath. "I will fly to Dragonstone on Drogon, accompanied by Regal. I'll bring a force to secure the Dragonglass mines. That can't wait. Meanwhile, the rest of you prepare fortifications and bring every possible man north. We have no time to lose." Some of the northern lords hesitated, as if worried about losing her presence in Winterfell. But Davos spoke up. "The Queen is right. The wall might hold for a time, but it won't if we can't arm ourselves properly. Dragonglass, Valyrian steel, and Dragonfire, these are our best weapons. We can't rely solely on the dragons. There may be times they can't be everywhere at once." Murmurs of agreement spread. Daenerys surveyed the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. Fear lurked there, yes, but also a spark of determination. They had faced wars, betrayals, famine, and cruelty, but an existential threat demanded unity of purpose. Thus, in the days that followed, Daenerys began her next great journey. She left a considerable portion of her knights and unsullied to guard Winterfell alongside Robb's northern levies, enough to hold the castle if the dead broke through the wall early. She took with her a smaller force of loyal men, among them some of her Dothraki bloodriders, who had come across the sea after hearing rumors that their Khaleesi ruled a land of stone castles and mighty dragons. She flew on Drogon's back, with Regal soaring behind. The rest followed by ship or traveled overland. Their destination: Dragonstone, the ancestral seat of House Targaryen, where beneath the ancient volcanic rock lay troves of obsidian, dragonglass. She did not relish leaving the north at such a crucial hour, but necessity drove her on. A single chest of obsidian arrowheads would not be enough to turn the tide in a war against thousands of whites. They needed wagons full, entire convoys. If the legends were true, there were great veins of it in Dragonstone's caves. The last she had seen of that island fortress was in the aftermath of Stannis' defeat. She had claimed it for her house, stationing a small garrison. Now it would serve a far more crucial purpose. The flight south was as cold as any Daenerys had ever taken. High winds whipped across the sky, droplets of icy rain stinging her face. Beneath her, Drogon's vast wings beat with unwavering strength, each stroke carrying them closer to the sea. She wore heavy furs, but still the chill seeped into her bones. Below, her retinue on horseback struggled through muddy roads, escorted by a handful of wagons. Many more men traveled by sea, sailing from White Harbor toward the narrow sea, to approach Dragonstone from the water. If all went well, they would converge at roughly the same time. Days blurred together. She tried to keep her mind focused on the mission, ignoring the pang of worry for those left behind in Winterfell. She recalled the haunting image of that caged wight. If the White Walkers commanded an entire host of such creatures, and if they possessed their own foul sorceries, then even her dragons might face challenges. Still, she believed wholeheartedly that fire was the great equalizer. She remembered how the dancing shadows of Melisandre had failed to harm her children, and yet a quiet dread gnawed at her. The unknown was always the greatest danger. At last, they reached the storm-racked seas that guarded Dragonstone. Daenerys and her aerial escort took to the sky. From a distance, the island looked as grim and imposing as she remembered. Black stone shaped like dragons' heads, narrow causeways battered by crashing waves, the castle perched high above jagged cliffs. The wind howled as Drogon descended, shrieking around the towers. The garrison she had left here, 50 men under the command of a loyal knight, Ser Martin Celtigar, awaited her in the courtyard, startled and scrambling as the immense dragon's bulk slammed onto the stone with a jarring impact. Regal landed behind, stirring eddies of salt spray and loose debris. Ser Martin knelt, though he was still wide-eyed from the sight of Drogon's continued growth. "Your Grace, we are honored by your presence. All is as you left it, though storms have battered the outer walls. The men have done what they can to repair them." "Well done," Daenerys said, dismounting with a fluid grace. She gazed up at the looming ramparts carved into dragon motifs. For a moment, A sense of ancestral nostalgia washed over her. Here Aegon had planned his conquest. Here Stannis had once claimed his birthright. Here she now stood, a Targaryen queen with living dragons at her side, poised to defend the realm from an ancient threat. "We have much to do. I trust you've kept the mines sealed since I left." Ser Martin rose, nodding. "Yes, Your Grace. No one has disturbed them save for occasional checks to ensure the tunnels hadn't collapsed. We posted men to guard them, as you ordered." "Excellent," Daenerys said. "We'll be bringing in a large contingent of workers soon. We need every piece of obsidian that can be safely excavated. Sharpened into arrowheads, spear points, daggers, whatever we can manage. Once the ships arrive, I want them loaded and sent north immediately." Ser Martin saluted. "It will be done." She spent the next day touring the tunnels beneath Dragonstone. The darkness pressed in around them, lit only by torches. The walls gleamed with obsidian deposits, some as black as midnight, others tinted green or red. In places, the air was uncomfortably warm, a reminder of the island's volcanic roots. Daenerys ran her gloved hand along a vein of obsidian, feeling the raw power beneath the stone. History whispered in these caverns. Valyrian magic, Targaryen secrets. Once, her ancestors had shaped basalt towers in the likeness of dragons. Now, she would shape a weapon to combat a threat beyond mortal comprehension. As the days turned into weeks, the operation expanded. Ships arrived from White Harbor and King's Landing, carrying men and equipment. Under Daenerys' supervision, miners extracted huge chunks of dragonglass, hauling them to forges set up in makeshift workshops near the castle's base. Skilled smiths hammered the obsidian into arrowheads and spear points. Each day, wagons departed for the port, where they were loaded onto ships bound for the north. If the seas were kind, the first shipments would reach White Harbor in a matter of weeks, then head overland to Winterfell. Daenerys divided her time between overseeing the mining operation and reviewing the island's defenses. Though she doubted the dead would march so far south anytime soon, she could not rule out any possibility. If the wall fell, the entire realm might burn or freeze before they could gather. She kept Drogon and Rhaegal circling the skies, making sure no one attempted a surprise attack on Dragonstone. But so far, the seas remained calm of enemies, if not of weather. The only real threat was the unending chain of storms. At night, she found herself pacing the halls of Dragonstone, haunted by the memory of that shrieking wight. She yearned for news from the north, for reassurance that the wall still held. Ravens came sporadically. One from Robb Stark reported that the White Walkers had tested the defenses at Eastwatch, but the Watch held them at bay with fire arrows and a timely arrival of reinforcements. Another raven told of the wildlings uniting under Tormund Giantsbane, crossing the wall through the gates with the Watch's permission. The Free Folk, once enemies, now joined forces with the Night's Watch. Such was the seriousness of the threat. Months passed. Summer had not yet ended formally, but the North knew only cold days and colder nights. Daenerys recognized that time was running short. Once winter truly descended, travel and supply lines would become more perilous. She oversaw the final shipments of dragonglass, ensuring that thousands of arrowheads, spearheads, and blades were on their way to the north. She could not glean how many they truly needed, but it was better to have a surplus. At last, she judged the operation sufficient for now. More men would remain behind to keep mining, keep forging. Daenerys, impatient to rejoin the north, prepared to depart with Drogon and Rhaegal, leaving behind only a small garrison. She arranged for the ships that brought her men to carry on transporting obsidian northward, trip after trip. She entrusted Ser Martin to manage the shipments, with strict instructions to send word if any trouble arose. Before dawn on the day of departure, Daenerys stood on the ramparts of Dragonstone, gazing out at the stormy sea. Her breath plumed in the cold air. Drogon perched on a massive turret behind her, tail thrashing. Rhaegal circled overhead, a green silhouette in the sky. She felt in her bones that a confrontation loomed. The chill wind carried with it a sense of foreboding. If the Night's Watch was already seeing increased attacks, it meant the White Walkers grew bolder. She needed to be at Winterfell to coordinate the defense. When the first streaks of pale light broke the horizon, Daenerys mounted Drogon. The massive dragon launched from the ramparts in a blast of wind, stone chips scattering. Rhaegal followed. Together, they soared high above Dragonstone, wing beats echoing against the raging surf. Below, soldiers and smiths looked up in awe and fear. Daenerys cast a final glance at the Black Fortress. In another time, she might have lingered, but the north called. They flew northward, covering leagues in hours. She paused only to let Drogon rest, landing in open fields or near small streams. Soon, the climate shifted again, the air turning sharper. She spotted flurries of snow drifting across the landscape. Each time she looked down, she saw columns of refugees, northerners fleeing south, free folk crossing farmland with battered wagons. War was not upon them yet, but the dread was palpable. It took only a few days of flight to reach Winterfell. As Daenerys descended into the courtyard, she was struck by how different the castle looked. Snow dusted the battlements. Large wooden beams and spikes jutted out from the walls, fortifications hastily erected for siege defense. The yard was crowded with new tents and supply wagons. Men from the Reach, the Stormlands, even the Vale had arrived to join the cause. The moment Drogon's talons touched the ground, soldiers gaped. Some hurried forward, likely to greet their queen, but many simply stared at the black dragon, awe and dread mingling in their eyes. Daenerys slid from the saddle, her legs slightly numb from the journey. Robb Stark hurried to meet her. He looked worn, dark circles under his eyes, but relief lit his features at the sight of her. "You've come just in time," he said, voice tense. "Word from Castle Black arrived only yesterday. Something stirs beyond the wall, and the Watch cannot keep it at bay much longer. They say the others gather their hordes, ready to march. We must prepare for open battle." Daenerys's expression hardened. "Then the time has come. We have dragonglass. Ships carrying it should reach White Harbor soon, if they haven't already. I'll see that the weapons are distributed. We must get them to the Watch quickly. The rest of our forces should mobilize as well. If the wall is going to be breached, we need to meet the enemy there or at least be ready to form a fallback line." Robb nodded, gesturing for her to follow him toward the main keep. "We can plan in the Great Hall. The lords are assembled. Men from all across the 7 kingdoms. Some might not be entirely loyal, but fear of the dead has brought them. Our biggest challenge is forging them into a cohesive army. The free folk have also come in droves, led by Tormund. They'd follow Mance Rayder if he were alive, but he fell at the wall, so Tormund is the next best thing. They don't bow to kneelers, but they will stand with us against the dead." As they walked, Daenerys glimpsed the throngs of new arrivals. She saw men bearing the son of House Dornish, the Falcon of the Vale, the Rose of Highgarden. The entire realm was represented here in one form or another, a phenomenon not seen since Robert's Rebellion, or perhaps even earlier. And it was not about a war of succession, but a war for survival. She felt a surge of grim determination. This was what she had wanted. A united realm, though not quite under the circumstances she ever imagined. Inside the Great Hall, the heat of braziers and packed bodies crashed over her. Lords, knights, and chieftains jostled for position around long tables. Missandei, who had traveled north by ship, was there, wearing heavier clothing than Daenerys had ever seen on her. Tyrion too had arrived, crossing via the King's Road with a small contingent from King's Landing. They both hurried over, relief evident on their faces. Tyrion inclined his head. "Your Grace, your timing is impeccable. We were just about to discuss battle formations. We've had quite the lively debates." Daenerys arched a brow. "I can imagine. Gather them. Let's begin." A hush spread through the hall as word of the Queen's return rippled outward. Daenerys stood at the head of the table, took a breath, and spoke. "Lords and ladies, knights and free folk, heed me. The Night's Watch reports an imminent assault by the White Walkers. The armies of the dead will soon march, if they haven't already. We have dragonglass weapons on the way. We have dragons. And we have each other. Men from all corners of the realm united as one host. Now we must decide how best to position ourselves to hold them back, or, failing that, delay them enough to regroup. We cannot allow them free passage into the heart of the north. She glanced at Robb. He stepped forward. I propose we send our strongest units to reinforce the wall. The watch cannot hold alone, but with additional men they might. The rest can stay here at Winterfell, preparing for a second line of defense if the wall falls. The free folk can scout the lands between the wall and Winterfell, slowing the dead's advance. The dragons will be key. They can strike swiftly at large concentrations of whites. But we must be cautious, or risk being overwhelmed. Tormund Giantsbane shoved his way forward, broad-chested and fiery-haired. We free folk know those lands better than any kneeler. We'll harass the dead, pick them off in small raids. But if we see one of them pale fuckers with the icy spears, that's the time to let the dragons do the talking. A rumble of nervous laughter spread, though it was tinged with fear. Tormund's frankness cut through the tension. Daenerys allowed herself a small smile, then turned to Tyrion. Tyrion rubbed his chin. Logistically, sending men to the wall is wise, but we must ensure they have enough food, enough shelter. The winter storms up there could kill as many men as the whites, if we're not careful. House Manderley and the Northern Lords can help coordinate supply lines from White Harbor. The Dragonglass shipments are crucial. No sense sending men to the wall if they have no weapons that can harm the others. Davos, standing nearby, nodded. I'll ride to White Harbor, oversee the arrival of those shipments, and escort them north. Daenerys surveyed the gathered leaders, letting their discussions swirl. She realized that for the first time since she had landed in Westeros, the Great Lords were not squabbling about petty claims. They were terrified, and in that terror, unified. She was about to give her own instructions when a sudden horn blast echoed from the courtyard. 3 sharp notes. Heads turned. Men grabbed for their weapons. 3 blasts, everyone knew the old lore. Once for rangers returning, twice for wildlings, thrice for the others. A hush seized the hall. Then chaos erupted. Shouts rose. Men jostled for the door. Daenerys's heart hammered. Could it be that the others were already upon them? The horn sounded again, thrice. She ran outside, pushing through the throng. Snow began to fall thickly, swirling in the courtyard. The watchers on the ramparts pointed north, faces pale. She looked up, past the walls. In the distance, the horizon seemed blurred with gray shapes, shifting and undulating. A massive storm cloud spread across the sky, as if night had come early. On the wind, she heard an eerie howling, a sound that set her teeth on edge. A chill more profound than any winter cold crawled up her spine. The words spilled from her lips unbidden. They're here. Men scrambled up to the battlements, stringing bows, hefting spears. Daenerys felt Drogon's presence in her mind, an eagerness for battle that bordered on rage. She let that flow into her, stealing her resolve. She had not expected them so soon. The plan had been to meet them at the wall. How had the dead bypassed the defenses? Could the rumors be true that a great ice dragon, a twisted mockery of life, had torn down a portion of the wall? She had no answers yet. Only the immediate reality that a black tide of whites was marching on Winterfell. The war for the living had begun in earnest, and the time for further strategy was over. Daenerys turned to Robb Stark, who looked grim but determined. "We make our stand here," she said, voice clear and unshaken despite the fear gripping her heart. "Archers, ready your arrows. Warriors, to the walls. Dragons, with me. We fight now, for the dawn." A wave of energy swept over the courtyard as men rushed to comply. Horn blasts sounded again, calling reinforcements to the battlements. The swirling snow thickened, turning the air into a haze of white. Then, through that veil, shapes emerged, unlie. Ving shapes with blue glowing eyes, a legion of the dead come to claim the living. Higher overhead, a roiling gloom flickered with unnatural lightning. Daenerys raised a hand to Drogon, who roared, exhaling a gust of flame into the sky. Across the yard, Rhaegal answered with his own roar, sounding like thunder. Soldiers drew dragonglass-tipped weapons. Some quaked in terror. Others steadied their hearts for the bloodshed to come. She swung into Drogon's saddle. "With me!" she cried, urging him skyward. The dragon launched, wings punching through the blizzard. Below, the dead closed in, unstoppable as a winter flood. They battered at the outer defenses, skeletons and corpses climbing in a mad frenzy. Arrows rained down, some tipped with obsidian, others normal steel. The normal steel had little effect, but where the obsidian found its mark, whites collapsed in clumps, dissolving into the icy wind. Daenerys soared above the fray, surveying the lines. She saw Robb Stark among his men, encouraging them to hold. Tormund led a band of wildlings at the gates, hacking away with dragonglass axes. The ground was already strewn with fallen whites, but they just kept coming. They seemed endless. A vile cold emanated from them, chilling the air to a near unbearable freeze. Gritting her teeth, Daenerys directed Drogon to strafe the undead with dragonfire. He inhaled and unleashed a rolling wave of flame that lit up the night like a new sun, incinerating whites by the dozens. The snow melted, the ground turned muddy, and a reek of scorched flesh filled the air. But more kept coming, climbing over the charred remains of their fellows. In the swirl of chaos, Daenerys sensed a new presence. A figure on an undead horse, tall and gaunt, eyes glowing blue, an armor of ice, a spear glistening like crystalline death. A white walker, maybe the Night King himself or one of his lieutenants. The creature surveyed the carnage from a distance, showing no fear. She pointed. Drogon roared and dove, spewing fire at the White Walker. But a swirl of ice coalesced, forming a protective barrier. The flames licked around the Walker, scorching the ground, but he emerged unscathed, raising his spear in challenge. Daenerys's heart lurched. If they could block dragonfire, the stories had not warned of that possibility. She felt Drogon's rage spike, and she urged him to circle around for another pass. Below, the living lines buckled, men screaming as whites crashed into the defenses. A desperate melee erupted. Dragonglass-bladed spears, swords, and axes rose and fell, shattering the whites, sending shards of bone and rotted flesh flying. But for every undead that fell, two more pressed in. The White Walkers directed them with silent authority, bringing bitter cold in their wake. Drogon unleashed another torrent of flame at the ice-armored figure. This time, Daenerys poured every ounce of will into the attack, focusing on the ancient Valyrian sorcery that empowered her dragons. The flame burned a fierce blue at the center, so hot it cracked the stone below. For a moment, the White Walker seemed to falter, ice shield melting, tendrils of steam swirling. Then the figure retreated, gliding backward with inhuman speed, calling whites to shield him. They vaporized in the flame, buying him time to vanish into the snowstorm. Daenerys let out a hiss of frustration. She soared back over the courtyard, scanning the lines for any sign of advantage. The walls were still manned, but the dead kept clawing upward. She saw Tormund hurl a torch at a cluster of whites, sending them shrieking away in flame. Robb Stark fought on the ramparts, swinging a Valyrian steel sword, ice, reforged from House Stark's ancestral blade, cleaving whites in half. A pack of undead wolves leapt at him, only to be skewered by men at his flank. Then from behind them, more whites poured in. The night wore on, a savage, grinding clash. Daenerys and Drogon, joined by Rhaegal, incinerated waves of undead, but it felt like trying to hold back an ocean with a bucket. She heard the screams of men as the whites dragged them down, heard the snarls of direwolves fighting to protect their masters. She glimpsed Tyrion on the walls, leading archers in volley after volley. She prayed that the dragonglass shipments had arrived in time, for normal weapons were worthless. Suddenly, an unnatural screech tore through the sky. Daenerys wheeled Drogon around, heart pounding. Out of the swirling darkness descended a shape like a dragon, but twisted and undead, ribs exposed, wings tattered, eyes glowing a sickly blue. It spewed a cold flame that turned a section of the battlements to jagged ice, freezing men where they stood. Daenerys felt her stomach drop. An ice dragon or a white dragon? Could it be one of her children turned against her? No, she had all three, unless she remembered tales of the Night King resurrecting the dead. If they had found some old dragon corpse or a creature from the Age of Legends, this was a horror beyond her imagining. The undead dragon swooped over the fortress, unleashing a storm of freezing breath that shattered stone and encased men in ice. Rhaegal roared a challenge and lunged, colliding mid-air with the abomination. They grappled, clawing and snapping. Chunks of undead flesh broke away from the ice dragon. Rhaegal blasted it with flame, but the flames sputtered, half quenched by the supernatural cold emanating from the beast's core. Drogon dove to assist, and Daenerys guided him to rake the undead dragon's flank with furious claws. She unleashed a torrent of Valyrian flame from close range, aiming to melt the monster's icy body. The undead dragon shrieked, rearing back. Part of its wing cracked, falling away in blackened chunks. Then it lashed out with frosty talons, scoring a deep gouge along Rhaegal's side. Rhaegal roared in pain, spinning away. Daenerys's breath caught. She could feel Rhaegal's distress, sensed the blood streaming from the wound. But the green dragon was not done. He whipped around and clamped his jaws on the undead dragon's shoulder, tearing away large sections of brittle bone and frozen flesh. Daenerys and Drogon blasted it again, focusing every bit of scorching power they had. Slowly, the undead dragon began to crack under the relentless heat, bits of icy membrane dissolving. With a final roar, Drogon sank his fangs into the creature's neck, ripping through the cold sinew. The beast collapsed, plummeting from the sky. It smashed into the battlefield below, exploding into shards of ice and rotted flesh. Yet the ground was littered with new whites rising from the fallen. Men screamed, retreating from the showers of frozen debris. Daenerys directed Drogon to land near Rhaegal, who flapped unsteadily. The green dragon was wounded, but still capable of flight. She reached out mentally, soothing him. Then she looked around. The courtyard was an inferno of battle, half mud, half ice. The living lines had shrunk, forced to cluster within the inner walls. She saw lumps of corpses, both living and dead, scattered everywhere. If they did not regroup, they would be overrun. She realized in a flash, the White Walkers had used the ice dragon as a diversion. While Daenerys and her dragons fought it in the sky, a massive wave of whites had poured through the shattered gates. The living were forced back into the keep, inch by bloody inch. Then she felt an even darker presence. A figure, tall and silent, stepping out of the swirling snow, spear of ice in hand. The Night King. She knew it had to be him, the commander of the dead. He stood amidst a horde of whites, gazing at her with a cold, inhuman stare. A challenge. Daenerys realized in that moment that if she could kill him, perhaps she could destroy the magic animating the rest. Rumors said the whites were linked to the White Walker's power. She had to try. She urged Drogon forward. The great black dragon bellowed, scorching the whites around the Night King, reducing them to ash. The Night King did not move, a silent sentinel in the flames. Daenerys gathered all her will, all the Valyrian power she could summon. Drogon unleashed a devastating blast of fire that lit the night like a second sun, focusing on the Night King's location. For an instant, Daenerys saw him vanish behind a curtain of flame. The roar of dragonfire lasted a long moment, the heat so intense it melted the snow for yards around. Daenerys exhaled, almost believing the threat was ended. But as the flames died away, the Night King remained. He raised his arms, eyes cold as death. Ice encrusted the ground around him, steam rising from his form as if he had parted the flames. It was impossible, yet there he stood, unharmed. Despair flickered in Daenerys's heart. How could he resist dragonfire? Even the White Walker she'd faced earlier had to retreat. The Night King, it seemed, was a power beyond. She felt Drogon's frustration in her mind, a savage fury that refused to accept defeat. She prepared for another strike, but the Night King acted first. He flung his ice spear with supernatural speed and precision. Drogon roared and lurched sideways, but not fast enough. The spear tore through part of his wing, sending a spray of hot blood and black scales raining onto the ground. A shriek of agony tore from Drogon's throat, echoing across the battlefield. Daenerys clung to the saddle, horror gripping her as she felt Drogon's pain. They spiraled, nearly crashing. Below, the Night King summoned more wights from the piles of bodies. A wave of fresh undead rose, clawing their way out of the carnage. The living defenders, wildlings, northern men, knights from the south, fought on with what strength remained, but they were exhausted, outnumbered, and many had fallen. The battle was turning into a slaughter. Rhaegal was still wounded, flailing above the ramparts. Tormund, Robb, Tyrion, Sansa, all were somewhere in that chaos, fighting for their lives. Daenerys felt Drogon's wing falter. He managed to regain some balance, flapping raggedly to land on a half-collapsed tower. His blood dripped onto the stones, sizzling with heat. The Night King strode forward through the wreckage, indifferent to the swirling snow and the fires raging around him. Daenerys tried again, pushing Drogon to unleash flame, but the dragon's injury dulled his power. The blast was shorter, less intense, and the Night King easily sidestepped it. In that moment, something else moved at the edge of Daenerys' vision. A figure leapt from the ramparts, brandishing a dagger. The Night King turned, as if sensing the motion, and Daenerys recognized the figure. Arya Stark, her face grim as death, brandishing a blade that glinted black, a dragonglass dagger. She hurled herself at the Night King, aiming for his back. But with preternatural speed, he whirled, catching Arya by the throat. She gasped, dropping the dagger. Time seemed to slow. Daenerys realized Arya had nearly succeeded in taking the Night King by surprise, but now the small woman dangled helplessly in his grasp. His icy grip would kill her in seconds. Daenerys hissed in fear and fury, urging Drogon to do something, anything. Arya's eyes flickered. She had a second blade hidden in her sleeve. In a blur, she let the first one drop, caught it with her free hand, and drove it upward into the Night King's chest. The dragonglass bit home, cutting through ice armor with a sharp crack. A blinding flash erupted. The Night King froze, releasing Arya. Cracks of shimmering blue light spread across his chest, up his neck, fracturing his form. His eyes glowed fiercely one last time. Then he shattered, exploding into shards of ice that dissolved into the wind. A sudden, deafening silence fell over the battlefield. The wights halted, convulsed, and collapsed in waves, as if their strings had been cut. The monstrous tide of undead fell to the ground, motionless. Winterfell's courtyard was littered with their remains. The White Walkers themselves had vanished like shattered sculptures. Arya hit the ground, gasping. Daenerys watched in awe from Drogon's vantage point, hardly daring to believe it. The entire army of the dead had collapsed in an instant, undone by the Night King's destruction. The walls of Winterfell were still standing, though battered and blackened. Men, living men, stared in shock at the piles of bodies that moments ago had been unstoppable killers. Cheers began to rise, disbelieving at first, then gathering strength. Daenerys guided Drogon down to the courtyard, ignoring the throbbing pain radiating from his wounded wing. Soldiers parted, letting her pass. She jumped down, running to where Arya lay. Robb was already there, crouched beside his sister, who coughed and spat out a bit of blood, but was alive. The dagger still gleamed, black as night, clutched in her hand. Daenerys knelt next to them, heart hammering. You killed him," Arya grimaced, a ghost of a smile flickering across her features. "Needed a good bit of luck. Or maybe he never saw me coming. The dead don't anticipate." Robb clasped her hand, tears in his eyes. The battered, blood-streaked men around them sank to their knees in relief. Tyrion limped forward, face pale but stunned. Tormund howled in victory. The courtyard rang with frantic cheers. Daenerys turned her gaze upward, noticing the black sky beginning to lighten. Dawn was near. The cold that had pressed in on them felt a bit gentler, as though the unspeakable chill of the Night King's power was already fading. She closed her eyes, exhaling a trembling breath. The war for the living was done in a single thrust of a blade. Countless had died. She could see that from the heaps of bodies, but so many more would have perished if the White Walkers had triumphed. Gently, she rose, letting Robb and Arya share a tearful, exhausted embrace. She looked around at the carnage. Dothraki, unsullied, northern men, southern knights, free folk. They had all fought side by side, no longer caring about crowns or claims. This was what unity could achieve, and it had been a mere slip of a Stark girl who delivered the finishing blow. A stroke of skill and nerve that no dragonfire could match. With the dawn breaking on the horizon, Daenerys felt tears in her eyes. She stepped back toward Drogon, stroking his flank as he settled painfully on the ruined courtyard. He had fought bravely. Regal, too, though still wounded, perched nearby, letting out a weary rumble. All around her, men collapsed in exhaustion, tears of relief on their faces. The dead lay in silent drifts, no longer a threat. Snow continued to fall softly, covering the battlefield with a quiet shroud. Somewhere within the keep, a bell began to toll, a slow, solemn note for the fallen, and for the passing of the darkest terror Westeros had seen in millennia. Daenerys took a deep breath, letting it out as a cloud of steam. She had come to Westeros expecting to conquer. And she had conquered, yes. But in the end, the greatest victory was not over petty kings, but over death itself. She gazed at the battered castle, at the living who remained, at the glow of dawn creeping into the sky. A new day had come. In that dawn, Daenerys Targaryen stood among the survivors, scars from battle etched into her dragon scales and her own heart. She thought of those lost, the men who had fallen, the countless sacrifices. The realm had bled, but it still lived. And with the Night King's defeat, a new chapter would begin. One of rebuilding, of forging a peace that might finally endure. She could not know what trials still awaited the Seven Kingdoms. There would always be more intrigues, more challenges. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet triumph. Her dragons, bigger than Balerion, had proven unstoppable against mortal foes. Yet it had been the cunning and bravery of a single girl with a dragonglass dagger that had felled the darkest threat. That was the truth of the realm. No single force, no single queen or dragon could do it alone. Took them all. As the sun's first rays spilled over the blood-stained snow, Daenerys bowed her head. Tomorrow, she would lead the realm into a new era, shaped by the lessons of this night. For now, she stood with her people, Targaryen, Stark, Lannister, Greyjoy, Tyrell, Martell, Baratheon, Free Folk, Dothraki, Unsullied, and remembered those who gave their lives. She closed her eyes against the sting of tears. She was Daenerys Stormborn, mother of dragons, breaker of chains, once more the savior of a people who had never known her name. She had not merely conquered the War of the Five Kings. She had ended the long night that threatened all. And though the cost was high, the realm still breathed. In that breath lay hope. And so the story went. Daenerys Targaryen, come early to Westeros, grown unstoppable by Valyrian sorcery that rendered her dragons impervious, had preempted battles among mortal kings and broken the war of the living with the edge of dragonfire. Yet in the darkest hour, it was unity, courage, and a simple blade of dragonglass that truly saved the realm. Fire and blood were her words, but in the end, it was all the living hearts burning together that banished death's chill. Dawn broke over Winterfell, over the battered illusions of old wars, and a queen stood ready to usher in a new age. One forged not by the fear of dragons alone, but by the shared will of the living to see another sunrise.